Tell me in the comments from where you are watching and what is the time there, and support me by subscribing the channel. The age of exploration was not a spontaneous event, nor did it erupt from a single cause. It was a slow, smouldering build-up, a tapestry of ambition, desperation, and intellectual awakening that stretched across centuries of European history. To understand why ships eventually set sail from Iberian harbors toward the edge of the known world, we must first understand the deep historical undercurrents that gave rise to this moment. Europe, in the aftermath of the early Middle Ages, was a continent scarred by feudalism and fractured by regional powers, yet poised on the cusp of profound transformation. Its economies were growing, its people were becoming more mobile, and its elites increasingly hungry, not just for goods, but for power, prestige, and knowledge. One of the most powerful motivators of this age was commerce, especially the trade in luxury goods that came from the East, goods that seemed almost mythical in their value and allure. Spices like black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were worth more than gold by weight in some European markets. These substances did more than flavor food. They preserved meat, masked spoilage, and, symbolically, brought status to those who could afford them. But such luxuries had to travel thousands of miles from Asia, crossing mountains, deserts, and seas, before reaching the bustling markets of Venice or Genoa. The Silk Road, a vast network of trade routes, carried not just spices but also silk, gems, ivory, porcelain, and even paper. Yet every mile of that journey added cost, and every kingdom or warlord that controlled a portion of it took their cut. By the 14th century, the route was both prohibitively expensive and increasingly unstable due to political fragmentation and rising Islamic power in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, seized by the Ottoman Turks, was a seismic event that had more than just symbolic consequences. For Europeans, it represented the loss of a final Christian bastion in the East and the consolidation of Muslim control over the primary land routes to Asia. The Ottomans, though pragmatic in trade, now held immense leverage. Access to Eastern goods became more difficult and more expensive, and many European powers began to question whether a maritime route to Asia could bypass the Muslim-controlled choke points. The geopolitical situation intensified not only economic motivations but also religious ones. The Islamic world was not merely a trading partner, was viewed by much of Christendom as a rival, even an existential threat. Reconquista Spain, crusading knights, and the papacy alike dreamt of converting souls, reclaiming lost Christian lands, and spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth. Exploration, therefore, began to take on a sacred character. It was commerce married to crusade, capitalism baptized in faith. Simultaneously, a silent revolution in thought and technology was underway, spurred by increasing contact with the Muslim world, as well as the absorption of Greek and Roman knowledge, preserved through Arabic texts. The works of Ptolemy, long lost to Western Europe, resurfaced, altering how people imagined the shape and scale of the world. The Earth was increasingly understood to be a spherical concept known to ancient thinkers but now given new credibility by empirical observation and reason. Navigation tools, too, began to evolve dramatically. The astrolabe, improved by Islamic astronomers, allowed mariners to determine latitude by measuring the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon. The magnetic compass, originating from China and refined by Arab traders, gave sailors a sense of direction even when clouds obscured the stars. Portolan charts, maritime maps with detailed coastlines, and compass roses offered better navigation. than the abstract world maps of medieval monasteries, which often prioritized biblical symbolism over geographic accuracy. Yet, even with better instruments and rising desire, the oceans remained terrifying. The Atlantic, in particular, was perceived by many as a vast, unknowable expanse, place where monsters might dwell and ships could vanish into oblivion. Medieval European maps, such as the Hereford Mappa Mundi, depicted fantastical beasts at the margins of the known world, echoing a deep fear of the unknown. And yet, slowly, curiosity began to erode that fear. The tales of Marco Polo, whose family had journeyed all the way to the court of Kublai Khan in China, fed the European imagination with visions of cities of gold, advanced civilizations, and untold riches. Though many readers questioned the truth of his accounts, his book became a medieval bestseller, spark in the minds of dreamers, scholars, and monarchs alike. This intellectual and psychological transformation created fertile ground for the boldest question of the age. What if the sea is not a barrier, but a bridge? European thinkers began to imagine that, if the land route to Asia was blocked, perhaps a maritime one could be found. The oceans were no longer just edges of the map, they were unexplored highways that could lead to wealth, power, and divine purpose. The spirit of exploration was not just about reaching new places, it was about rethinking what was possible. Thus, on the eve of the 15th century, Europe stood at a crossroads. Its rulers and merchants were constrained by geography, threatened by rivals, and tempted by the East. Its thinkers were armed with rediscovered knowledge and a restless drive to apply it. Its ships were more agile, its maps more accurate, and its people more daring. The age of exploration was not yet underway, but the wind was rising and the sails were being stitched. The horizon beckoned not as an end, but as a beginning. As the winds of change began to stir across Europe, no region felt them more strongly, or responded more decisively than the Iberian Peninsula. Comprised primarily of two emerging Christian kingdoms, Portugal and Castile, soon to unite with Aragon as Spain, Iberia in the 15th century was a crucible of religious zeal, political ambition, and seaborne opportunity. It was a land long shaped by war and reconquest, having spent centuries locked in battle with Muslim powers in a bitter and prolonged campaign known as the Reconquista. By the late 1400s, this holy war was nearing its final stages, and a warrior, nobility long steeped in conquests, sought new frontiers to pursue glory, wealth, and divine favor. The oceans, once perceived as boundaries, now seemed like a new battlefield for faith and fortune. Portugal, small in size but rich in maritime ambition, was the first to fully commit to a vision of oceanic exploration under the steady leadership of the House of Aves, and driven especially by Prince Henry the Navigator. Portugal began to look southward toward the vast and largely unmapped coast of Africa. Prince Henry, despite his moniker, rarely sailed himself. Instead, he orchestrated voyages, gathered scholars, financed shipyards, and established a school of navigation at Sagres, where cartographers, sailors, and scientists pooled their knowledge. His motivations were multifaceted: a desire to find a sea route to the riches of the East, to spread Christianity, and to bypass the Islamic strongholds that restricted trade across the Mediterranean and North Africa. In many ways, Prince Henry represents the prototype of the European explorer, a man of learning and faith, driven by both economic logic and ideological fervor. Portuguese navigators began a slow but steady process of coastal exploration along West Africa, often only pushing a few dozen or 100 miles farther than the last expedition. They mapped river mouths, studied wind patterns, and established trade posts. It was through this methodical, incremental process that they eventually rounded Cape Bajadora, feared promontory, once considered the edge of the world. This breakthrough shattered a major psychological barrier. Beyond Bajador, they discovered new coastlines, gold-rich regions, and burgeoning trade networks in Africa. The Portuguese began to engage in trade first in gold and ivory, and later, tragically, in enslaved human beings, sowing the seeds of a transatlantic slave trade that would grow into one of history's darkest legacies. Meanwhile, to the west, the crown of Castile soon to merge with Aragon through the marriage of Isabella I and Ferdinand II was undergoing its own transformation. The final defeat of the Emirate of Granada in 1492 would mark the end of Muslim rule in Spain, and with it, the release of vast resources and the redirection of religious fervor outward. The same year Granada fell, the Spanish monarchs would approve a bold proposal from an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus, signaling their late but dramatic entry into the race for global discovery. But even before this momentous decision, Spain was watching Portugal closely. The voyages of the Portuguese had stirred a rivalry, geopolitical and religious contest between two powers emerging from centuries of war, both now eager to turn their swords into rudders and their galleons into weapons of dominion. These Iberian kingdoms had key advantages. Their position at the southwestern edge of Europe gave them direct access to the Atlantic. Their coasts were dotted with natural harbors, and their economies, particularly in Portugal, were increasingly oriented toward maritime commerce. Moreover, their shipbuilders and navigators had begun to master the design of the caravel, a revolutionary vessel, lightweight, fast, and capable of sailing closer to the wind than traditional ships. The caravel could tack against prevailing breezes and make long ocean voyages feasible, with triangular lateen sails and deep, ocean-worthy hulls. These ships became the preferred tool of the explorers, enabling Portugal and Spain to outpace northern rivals, still wedded to older, less agile craft. But beyond all logistical and technological factors, there was something else stirring in the Iberian spirit, an insatiable appetite for glory, for imperial grandeur, and for shaping history. In the minds of kings and navigators alike, the world was a chessboard of divine design, waiting to be unveiled and dominated. The Christian mission of conversion, the chivalric code of conquest, and the mercantile lust for spice and gold all converged into a singular, aggressive vision, expansion, and Iberia would lead the charge. Thus, by the mid-15th century, the groundwork was laid. Portugal had begun to press ever further down the African coast, laying claim to islands and territories that would soon be used as staging grounds for transoceanic journeys. Spain, flush with victory at home and ambition abroad, prepared to leap into the unknown with a vision that would forever alter the world's geopolitical and cultural landscape. The Atlantic was no longer a wallet, had become a highway, and the Iberians were first to pave it. Beyond trade routes and seafaring technology, something even more profound drove the European mind toward the ocean's edge, a changing worldview. The late Middle Ages and early Renaissance marked a shift in human consciousness from a world defined by divine mystery to one shaped by human potential. The Renaissance, born in the city-states of Italy and carried across the continent, reignited a fascination with knowledge, art, and classical antiquity. Scholars and explorers alike began to believe that the world could be measured, understood, and mastered. This new spirit of inquiry didn't just live in dusty libraries or philosophical debates. It was taken to sea, embodied by men who believed that navigating across oceans could unlock the secrets of Earth itself. The Renaissance worldview was fueled by three key intellectual forces: humanism, empiricism, and a revival of classical geography. Humanism encouraged the belief that humans could shape their own destiny rather than simply submit to divine will. While not in conflict with Christianity per se, it emphasized rationality, observation, and direct experience, all essential to the explorer's mindset. Empiricism, the idea that knowledge should be derived from observed reality rather than inherited dogma, took root in European science. Navigators started to trust their instruments, logbooks, and eyes more than hearsay or scripture when charting unknown waters. Meanwhile, the rediscovery and translation of Ptolemy's Geography, an ancient Greco-Roman treatise on cartography and world measurement, gave new structure to map-making. Though flawed, it introduced ideas of latitude, longitude, and a spherical Earth that profoundly shaped how explorers envisioned the planet. But the Renaissance was not alone in animating the European quest for discovery. Christianity, particularly in its militant and triumphalist forms, deeply infused the age with theological urgency. After centuries of internal division, schisms, and crusades, Europe was emerging with a hardened spiritual resolve. The Catholic Church, reeling from the Avignon papacy and internal reform movements, saw in exploration an opportunity for renewal and expansion. Popes began to issue papal bulls, or decrees, that granted Christian monarchs the divine right to claim lands and convert heathens wherever they might be found. This blend of spiritual mission and imperial entitlement justified everything from exploration to conquest, from the baptism of indigenous peoples to the appropriation of entire continents. For monarchs like Prince Henry of Portugal or Isabella of Castile, conversion was not merely a religious gesture, it was a political act. Saving souls was linked to securing power. The souls of Africa, Asia, and the as yet unknown Americas were imagined as part of a spiritual battlefield between Christendom and the infidel world. This framework elevated exploration from a gamble into a divine mandate. Missionaries, often Franciscans and later Jesuits, would accompany expeditions as spiritual vanguards, aiming to plant the cross wherever the flag was raised. The age of exploration was not a secular phenomenon. It was a spiritual crusade in maritime form. At the same time, European popular culture began to swell with myths, rumors, and fantastical expectations about what lay beyond the known world. Tales of Prester John, a mythical Christian king said to rule a wealthy kingdom somewhere in Africa or Asia, captured the imagination of generations. Some believed he might be a powerful ally in the fight against Islam. Others hoped his lands were the key to untold riches. Likewise, legends of the Spice Islands, cities of gold, fountains of youth, and monstrous races with dog heads or no heads at all populated the margins of medieval maps and mines. These were not merely whimsical fantasies, they acted as imaginative lures, giving explorers a sense that magic, wealth, and divine destiny lay just over the horizon. Taken together, these forces, the rationalism of the Renaissance, the zeal of Christianity, and the enduring pull of mythology, created an unstoppable cultural momentum. For the first time, there existed not just the means to explore through ships, instruments, and financing, but also the mindset to justify and celebrate it. Exploration was no longer heresy or folly, it was heroism. To sail into the unknown was to challenge the limits of human understanding and carry the banner of civilization into darkness. And for those who succeeded, eternal glory awaited in chronicles, in crowns, and in the favor of both king and god. By the end of the 15th century, the pieces were in place. The continent that had once turned inward after Rome's fall was now turning outward with feverish ambition. The winds of curiosity had become gales of destiny, and the ships crowding the harbors of Lisbon, Seville, and Paulos were preparing to alter the course of world history. They would cross oceans, reshape empires, destroy civilizations, and forge new ones, all in pursuit of something they could not yet fully name. Gold, God, glory, and the world would never be the same. In the early 15th century, Portugal was a relatively minor kingdom nestled on the western edge of Europe, distant from the centers of power in Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. It had only recently emerged from a turbulent struggle for independence from Castile, and its lands were modest in size, with a population that paled in comparison to larger European powers. Yet it was precisely this peripheral position that gave Portugal its edge. Facing the Atlantic Ocean, and with few internal lands to expand into, Portugal naturally turned outward. Its rugged coastlines became not boundaries, but launchpads, and under the ambitious and calculated leadership of its monarchy, especially the enigmatic Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal would become the first European nation to systematically explore the world beyond Europe's shores. The conditions that birthed Portugal's maritime empire were not accidental. After securing its independence in the late 14th century, the Portuguese monarchy under King João I and the House of Avis sought new ways to consolidate power, boost national prestige, and secure economic prosperity. Unlike inland kingdoms, Portugal's geographic orientation forced it to look to the sea for trade, resources, and expansion. Its sailors had long plied the waters of the Atlantic and the Iberian coast, engaging in fishing, short-haul commerce, and piracy. However, these ventures were largely localized and opportunistic until Prince Henry, the third son of King João, transformed exploration from a seaborne curiosity into a national project. Prince Henry, born in 1394 in Porto, was not destined for the throne, but he was destined to shape Portugal's and the world's future. Educated in theology, mathematics, and astronomy, and seasoned by his participation in the 1415 conquest of Ceuta, a Muslim stronghold in North Africa, Henry saw firsthand the wealth and strategic significance of Islamic trade centers. Ceuta served as both a commercial and ideological turning point. It exposed the Portuguese court to the riches of the trans-Saharan trade, which brought gold, slaves, and spices north from sub-Saharan Africa to Islamic markets. Henry became obsessed with the idea of tapping into this wealth at its source directly by pushing beyond the known limits of Africa's western coast. To achieve this, Henry took an unprecedented step. He established a center of navigation and exploration at Sagres, on Portugal's southwestern tip. Though historians debate the precise nature of this school, what emerged at Sagres was a powerful knowledge-hub informal think tank where some of the finest cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and navigators of the age collaborated. Drawing from Arab, Jewish, and European sources, they compiled new maps, refined navigational techniques, and developed a maritime culture rooted in experimentation, observation, and boldness. This was not a university in the modern sense, but a strategic incubator, perhaps the world's first modern research institute dedicated to global exploration. Key to this movement was the caravel, a revolutionary vessel that fused Iberian, Moorish, and Mediterranean shipbuilding traditions. Light, fast, and capable of tacking against the wind using its lateen sails, The caravel could hug coastlines or brave the open sea, depending on the navigator's needs. It replaced the heavier, clumsier cogs of the medieval era and allowed for sustained voyages with smaller crews and better maneuverability. Combined with the compass, quadrant, and increasingly accurate Portolan charts, it gave Portuguese mariners a technological edge over their European rivals. Prince Henry began funding and organizing expeditions not for conquest, at least not initially, but for discovery, mapping, and intelligence gathering. His ships crept along the West African coast in cautious increments, gradually filling in the blanks on maps that had been speculative at best. For decades, progress was slow and often frustrating. Sailors spoke of sea monsters, boiling equatorial waters, and divine punishments for trespassing into unknown realms. But Henry was patient and persistent. He understood that the sea would yield its secrets, not to rash adventurers, but to disciplined, systematic investigation. Under his guidance, Portuguese ships pushed beyond Cape Bajador in 1434, a milestone that shattered medieval superstitions and opened the African coastline to further navigation. The rounding of Cape Bajador was more than a geographical triumph, it was a psychological conquest. For centuries, this promontory had represented the outer boundary of the navigable world. According to medieval law, ships that passed beyond it would be sucked into whirlpools, scorched by the sun, or fall off the edge of the earth. These beliefs were deeply ingrained, even among seasoned sailors. When Gil Eanes, a Portuguese navigator, under Henry's patronage, successfully returned from beyond Bajador with news that the seas were navigable, it sparked a wave of confidence in Portugal's maritime ambitions. Fear was replaced with curiosity, myth with method. By the time of Prince Henry's death in 1460, Portuguese mariners had charted much of the West African coast as far south as present-day Sierra Leone. They had made contact with various African kingdoms, established trade in gold and ivory, and planted the seeds of what would later become the Atlantic slave trader. Tragic and brutal enterprise that would scar human history for centuries. Though Henry himself may not have fully grasped the long-term implications of this commerce, the infrastructure and ideological foundations were being laid during his lifetime. In short, Prince Henry did not sail the world himself, but he redesigned the very idea of exploration. He transformed Portugal from a coastal outpost into the vanguard of global navigation, investing in knowledge, ships, and human capital at a scale unmatched in his time. His legacy would not only guide future Portuguese explorers like Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama, but would serve as a model for other European powers hungry to unlock the riches of the wider world. With Henry's death, the stage was set for Portugal's golden age of exploration and for the next act in a drama that was now fully underway. The race to reach India, to chart unknown seas, and to rewrite the geography of the human imagination. With Prince Henry's passing in 1460, the wheel of Portuguese expansion did not slow, it gained momentum. His successors, building on the intellectual, navigational, and institutional foundation he laid, pushed further down the African coastline, their ships now equipped with better tools, refined maps, and a growing appetite for both wealth and dominion. The Portuguese approach remained methodical, unlike later empires that lunged greedily into conquest. Portugal at this stage favored incremental progress, guided by scientific observation and trial and error. Every new cape rounded, every river mouth entered, was a brushstroke on a canvas that had never been fully drawn. The Atlantic was no longer a feared abyss, it was a field of opportunity. One of the most critical advances came with the exploration of the Cape Verde Islands, a volcanic archipelago lying west of modern-day Senegal, though likely known to North African and perhaps Norse sailors centuries earlier. The Portuguese made the first definitive claim in the mid-1460s. The islands were uninhabited, but their position made them strategically ideal. They offered safe harbors, fresh water, and eventually fertile lands. Portugal quickly realized the value of using Cape Verde as a logistical base for longer voyages. These islands would soon become a prototype for colonial plantation economies, where sugarcane grown with increasing dependence on enslaved African labor would generate enormous profits and model future transatlantic ventures in Brazil and the Caribbean. Pushing south, Portuguese explorers reached the Senegal and Gambia rivers. Probing into the interior in search of gold, they had heard legends from North African traders of the fabled Gold Coast, where vast quantities of gold were traded in the markets of empires like Mali and Songhai. These weren't empty rumors. The region of Elmina, located in modern-day Ghana, would soon prove to be one of the richest gold-producing areas on the continent. In 1471, Portuguese ships made contact with these lucrative trading networks, and within a few years, King João II had authorized the construction of Snohorhe, de Mina Elmina Castle, in 1482. This fort was not just a trading post, it was the first major European structure built south of the Sahara, and it marked the beginning of a physical, architectural, and military footprint along the African coast. Fortified with cannons and garrisoned with soldiers, Elmina became a symbol of Portuguese resolve to dominate Atlantic trade. But gold was not the only commodity. As Portuguese presence grew, so too did their involvement in the African slave trade. What had begun as a peripheral enterprise, trading a few captives for textiles or horses, became systematized. Slaves were captured or purchased from local African rulers and sold across the Portuguese world to sugar plantations in the Azores, Madeira, and Cape Verde, and eventually to the Americas. In the late 15th century, Lisbon became one of the largest slave markets in Europe. The crown imposed taxes on every enslaved person sold, turning human bondage into a central source of royal revenue. This brutal economic engine would fuel European empires for centuries to come, though often sanitized in early chronicles. The slave trade was deeply embedded in the logic of exploration. It was about control of labor, as much as control of land. Despite these dark developments, Portuguese expansion during this period also involved cultural and diplomatic encounters that were complex and varied. Not all African kingdoms were subjugated or deceived. In many cases, they engaged in negotiation, alliance building, and resistance, depending on the circumstances. Kingdoms like Benin and Congo interacted with the Portuguese diplomatically, trading goods and exchanging envoys. The Kingdom of Congo, in particular, underwent partial Christianization, with its rulers adopting European names, building churches, and sending emissaries to Lisbon. These interactions were not simply one-sided impositions, they were entanglements, mutual, often uneasy arrangements where power, belief, and interest intersected as Portuguese ships advanced. So too did their grasp of wind systems, a development that would prove crucial. Sailors began to understand the volta do mar, or turn of the sea, a counterintuitive sailing technique, involving wide arcs westward into the Atlantic in order to catch favorable winds for the return journey. It was this insight that allowed the Portuguese to sustain voyages over long distances, chart return routes, and break free from the limitations of coastal navigation. With each expedition, they gathered data on currents, tides, coastal peoples, climate, and trade networks. Their maps became repositories of power, filled with more than just coastlines. They recorded places of wealth, of danger, of potential. Dominion, cartography, and conquest were now indivisible. By the end of the 1480s, Portugal had reached the Gulf of Guinea, edging ever closer to the equator and into new climatic zones that had previously terrified mariners. These latitudes brought intense heat, unpredictable storms, and unfamiliar stars in the night sky. Superstition still clung to the edges of sailors' minds, but it was now outweighed by evidence and experience. Each successful voyage redefined what was possible. The old medieval world, bounded by church doctrine and mythical beasts, was dissolving before their eyes, replaced by a dynamic, empirical, and expansionist worldview. The known world was expanding not just geographically, but ideologically. Portugal was no longer simply a kingdom on Europe's edge. It had become the nexus of a growing global network, reaching into Africa, poised to cross into the Indian Ocean, and increasingly confident in its mission to dominate maritime trade. But before that final barrier could be crossed, one final cape loomed in the distance, one that had confounded explorers for decades. The key to the east still lay beyond reach, hidden at the bottom of Africa. The quest to find it would become the obsession of kings, captains, and cartographers alike. As the 15th century neared its end, Portugal stood at the precipice of a monumental discovery. The African coastline had slowly unfolded like a scroll beneath their caravels, first through fear and folklore, then through knowledge and mastery. But the prize Portugal had been pursuing since Prince Henry's first expeditions was still elusive, a direct sea route to India. Everyone knew the riches of the East, silks, spices, precious stones, waited on the far side of the continent. But the southern tip of Africa remained uncharted, feared, and persistently out of reach. Sailors whispered of fierce currents, colossal waves, and tempests that could rip sails from their masts. To round that tip, to break into the waters of the Indian Ocean, would be to unlock an entirely new world. The mission was as much mythic as material. In 1487, under the reign of King João II, the task fell to a seasoned navigator, Bartolomeu Dias, a man of experience, caution, and immense resolve. Dias commanded 3 ships, and his orders were precise: as far south as possible, and, if the coastline turned eastward, press onward toward India. What followed was one of the most dramatic and perilous voyages in the early history of global navigation. The expedition followed the familiar West African coast to the Congo, and then into the increasingly hostile waters of the southern Atlantic. After passing Walvis Bay and reaching Angra dos Ilhéus, Dias made a bold and dangerous decision. He sailed into open ocean to avoid the unpredictable coastal winds. For nearly a month, his fleet lost sight of land entirely, battered by storms, and forced ever southward by howling winds. Supplies dwindled, morale cracked, but finally, in early 1488, the ships turned northeast and spotted land again. Now far beyond the known charts near modern-day Marshall Bay on the southern coast of Africa. Without realizing it, Dias had done it. He had rounded the southern tip of Africa, unknowingly crossing the threshold into the Indian Ocean, but the weather remained relentless. His crew, exhausted and near mutiny, begged him to return. Dias complied, but on the homeward journey, he finally saw the southernmost point from the Sea of Fierce headland that jutted into turbulent waters, where 2 oceans collided in fury. He named it the Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms. But when news of the discovery reached King João II, the monarch had a different vision. He renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, Cabo da Boa. Esperanza, for it signaled hope, not terror. It promised a way forward, a route to India, to the spices of Calicut and the riches of Asia. Dias had not reached India himself, but he had opened the door, and that made him one of the most important explorers of all time. Dias's voyage was not merely a nautical achievement. It marked a philosophical turning point, proof that the world was navigable, that the great barriers of nature could be overcome by human courage, knowledge, and perseverance. His journey also served as a template. Carefully charted coastlines, detailed logs of winds and currents, and first encounters with new environments were meticulously recorded. Future navigators would stand on the shoulders of this information, sailing farther, faster, and with more confidence. Upon his return, Dias faded into relative obscurity, overshadowed in his lifetime by later figures like Vasco da Gama, who would use his maps and route to complete the voyage to India a decade later. Still, Dias remained involved, helping design the ships that would carry da Gama eastward and eventually perishing in a storm off the cape he had once conquered. His life ended where his legend began, as if the ocean that had yielded its secret to him demanded a final toll. Meanwhile, Portugal's imperial infrastructure accelerated. Forts were established along the Gold Coast and the Congo. Treaties and hostilities with African kingdoms became more frequent. Lisbon became a hive of imperial administration, cartographic scholarship, and commercial planning. Portuguese nobles and merchants grew rich from the trade in gold, ivory, and enslaved Africans. The monarchy, now one of the wealthiest in Europe, directed its gaze further east, with India, Southeast Asia, and China shimmering like treasures at the edge of imagination. But Dias's voyage had another consequence, one Portugal never anticipated. It sparked envy. Other European powers, especially Castile, soon to be part of unified Spain, watched these developments with a mixture of awe and alarm. If Portugal could claim a sea route to Asia, bypassing Islamic and Italian trade networks, it could monopolize global commerce. The Portuguese crown's claim to these new routes was formalized in a bold document, the Papal Bull Romanus Pontifex 1455, which granted Portugal dominion over all newly discovered lands south of Cape Bajador. The Treaty of Alcacar 1479, and soon after the Treaty of Tordesillas 1494, would attempt to carve up the unknown world between the Iberian crowns. Tensions brewed. A new race was about to begin, not just to explore the world, but to divide it. Thus, with Dias's return, Portugal stood triumphant. It had navigated further than any European kingdom since antiquity, wrested control over vital African trade routes, and was poised to bridge Europe and Asia across the vast southern ocean. The African coast was no longer a mystery, it was a corridor. The Indian Ocean was no longer a legend, it was within reach. Dias had turned fear into a gateway, and in doing so, he helped shift the axis of the world. In the decades leading up to 1492, the European imagination strained at the limits of known geography. The Portuguese had rounded Africa's Cape of Storms, edging ever closer to India by hugging coastlines and relying on incremental gains. But, to some, this path, long, perilous, and dependent on African intermediaries, was not the only answer. What if one could reach Asia by sailing west across the mysterious Atlantic Ocean? It was a dangerous idea, one dismissed by most scholars, rejected by cautious monarchs, and derided by experienced mariners. But for one man, a Genoese sailor of humble origins named Cristoforo Colombo, known to history as Christopher Columbus, It was a dream too powerful to abandon. Columbus was born around 1451 in Genoa, a maritime republic in northern Italy, famed for its seafarers and traders. His early years were spent not among the nobility, but in the bustling docks, markets, and shipyards of a city that thrived on ocean commerce. Though his formal education was limited, Columbus devoured books, maps, and travel accounts with obsessive hunger. He read Marco Polo's account of the East with awe, absorbed classical geographies such as Ptolemy's maps, and took deep interest in newer theories suggesting a spherical Earth, ideas long known among scholars but increasingly debated in terms of scale and distance. The question wasn't whether the world was round. Educated people across Europe had accepted that for centuries, but how big it was, and what, if anything, lay between Europe and Asia across the Atlantic. Columbus was convinced that Asia lay only about 2,400 nautical miles west of Europe. This was a dramatic underestimation, based on flawed readings of Ptolemy and miscalculations of the Earth's circumference. In reality, the true distance was more than 10,000 nautical miles, a journey that, without the Americas in the way, would have almost certainly ended in death. But Columbus didn't know that, and crucially, he didn't need to be right. He only needed someone to believe in his confidence. For years he lobbied European courts, first in Portugal, where King João II, unimpressed by Columbus's fuzzy math and wary of abandoning the African route, dismissed him. He tried Genoa, Venice, and even England. He was often laughed out of court, ridiculed for his arrogance and wild proposals. But Columbus was relentless. He believed not only in the feasibility of his voyage, but in its divine purpose. His vision was not just navigational, it was apocalyptic. He saw himself as a chosen instrument to fulfill Christian prophecy, to open the way to Jerusalem, convert distant souls, and gather the wealth needed to fund a final crusade before the end of days. For Columbus, exploration was wrapped in religious destiny, a sacred mission written in the stars, at last. In the newly united Kingdom of Spain, Columbus found a pair of monarchs willing to listen. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, fresh from their final victory over the Moors in Granada in January 1492, were eager to expand their influence and match Portugal's maritime success. With Iberia now fully Christian and flush with crusading zeal, they turned their gaze outward. Columbus approached them again, and this time, against the advice of many counselors, they said yes. The capitulations of Santa Fe, signed in April 1492, granted Columbus extraordinary privileges. He would be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, receive 10% of the profits from any discoveries, and be made Viceroy and Governor of any lands he claimed. For an obscure foreigner, these were staggering terms, but Ferdinand and Isabella calculated the risk. A single shipwreck would cost little, while success could bring them untold riches and global prestige. They financed a modest fleet of 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the largest and Columbus's flagship, and 2 smaller caravels, the Nina and the Pinta. The stage was set. Columbus was not sailing into the void, but into a gamble of celestial magnitude. He believed he would reach Cathay, China, Cheongju, Japan, and the Great Khan's court by traversing a relatively narrow ocean. What he would find instead was an entire continent, one unknown to Europe, Africa, and Asia alike, and his arrival would trigger one of the most profound ruptures in human history. The world before 1492 was already complex, filled with diverse civilizations, trade routes, and technological exchanges. But in that moment, when 3 small ships slipped westward over the horizon, that world was about to be forged into one, not gently, but through fire, steel, and disease. And Columbus, bold and flawed, visionary and stubborn, would be the unlikely catalyst. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, from the port of Palos de la Frontera, Christopher Columbus set sail into the Atlantic aboard 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Nina, and the Pinta. The departure was quiet, almost mundane. Few could have predicted the cataclysmic effects this voyage would unleash. Yet, in this moment, a centuries-long process was initiated, the binding together of worlds that had developed in isolation for millennia. The Atlantic, once a barrier, was about to become a bridge. For Columbus and his crew, however, the crossing was not yet triumphal. It was unknown, untested, and deeply perilous. Though Columbus projected confidence in his plan to reach Asia, he was acutely aware of the uncertainties. His navigational estimates were deeply flawed, based on the assumption that the Eurasian landmass stretched much farther east than it did and that the Earth was significantly smaller. Still, he sailed with faith in his knowledge, his divine mission, and in the seaworthiness of his vessels. The Santa Maria was a larger carrack, with a deep hull, while the Nina and Pinta were nimble caravels, crewed by about 90 men, most of them from Andalusian ports. The expedition set course for the Canary Islands first, stopping there for resupply and ship repairs before turning west into the open ocean on September 6, 1492. The voyage across the uncharted Atlantic was slow, uncertain, and psychologically taxing. For over a month, the ships traversed a vast expanse with no land in sight. The wind patterns, however, proved favorable. They had entered the northeast trade winds, which reliably pushed them westward. Columbus noted this in his logbooks, which became more than navigational tools. They were part of a dual performance. He kept 2 logs, one accurate, and another for the crew, downplaying the distance traveled to prevent panic. Tensions mounted regardless. As days turned into weeks, restlessness and fear began to creep in. Many crewmen were simple fishermen and coastal sailors, unaccustomed to long-distance navigation without sight of land. Mutiny became a real threat. Sailors feared they might fall off the edge of the world, or that the sea would stretch endlessly with no coast in sight. They encountered signs floating vegetation, unusual bird sightings, but these only heightened their hopes and their frustration as no land appeared. On October 10th, according to Columbus's journals, there was a mutiny. The men demanded they turn back. Columbus negotiated, perhaps embellished, later accounts, and persuaded them to continue just a few days more. Then, the signs intensified. On October 11th, a carved piece of wood and a branch with berries were seen floating in the water. Finally, in the early morning hours of October 12, 1492, at roughly 2 a.m., a sailor aboard the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, sighted land. The cry of "Tierra, tierra" erupted across the decks. Columbus, following protocol and his own ambition, later claimed to have seen the light of land himself a few hours earlier, ensuring that he would receive the lifetime pension promised by the Spanish crown. For the first sighting, they had arrived, but not in Asia. What they encountered was one of the islands of the Bahamas, known to its native inhabitants as Guanahani. Columbus named it San Salvador. The people who greeted them were members of the Taino, a peaceful, agricultural society that had lived on these islands for generations. Columbus, however, interpreted everything he saw through the lens of his own expectations. He believed he was near Japan or perhaps off the coast of India, and he called the people Indios, a name that would become tragically entrenched. Columbus's journal from that first encounter is revealing. He noted the nakedness, gentleness, and hospitality of the Taino, remarking that they were quick to trade and showed no knowledge of iron or weapons. He was struck by their vulnerability and wrote that they would make excellent servants and could easily be converted to Christianity. In those early moments of contact, the pattern of conquest, evangelism, and exploitation was already forming. Over the next several weeks, Columbus and his men explored more islands, including Cuba and Hispaniola. Still convinced they were skirting the coasts of Asia, the Santa Maria would be lost to a shipwreck on December 24th, forcing Columbus to leave behind a small settlement called La Navidad on Hispaniola Rupe's first foothold in the Americas. Relationships with native peoples grew more complex and strained as misunderstandings, cultural clashes, and demands for gold escalated. By early 1493, Columbus returned to Spain aboard the Nina, his crew weathered and his ships battered, but his ambitions vindicated. He brought back exotic parrots, unfamiliar fruits, a few captured Taino people, and most importantly, the news. He had sailed west to reach lands no European had seen before, and he was convinced these were the fringes of the East. In truth, he had found something far more significant, an entirely new continent, though neither he nor his contemporaries yet understood the scale of the discovery. Columbus was welcomed as a hero in Spain. His triumph, inflated by royal propaganda, marked a turning point in European history. The Atlantic was now open, its crossing proven. The age of exploration had irrevocably expanded its stage, and what had been a gamble was now a race. When Columbus returned to Spain in March 1493, he carried with him not just exotic goods and captives, but a revolution in perception. His reports, shaped by ambition and religious fervor, insisted he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. His letters described a land of mild peoples, fertile soil, and riches just waiting to be claimed. To the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, this wasn't just a navigational breakthrough, it was a divine vindication. Their patronage had opened the gates to what they believed was the East. Spain, long overshadowed by Portugal in exploration, had seemingly outflanked its rival with a bold new route. But in truth, no one yet knew what Columbus had really found. He believed he had reached the Indies. Most of Europe did too at first, but over the next few years, confusion reigned. The lands he described didn't quite match Marco Polo's accounts of Cathay or Chipangu. There were no great cities of marble, no emperors in silk, no spices in abundance. Instead, there were palm-fringed islands inhabited by unfamiliar peoples with unfamiliar customs. Nevertheless, these discoveries ignited an explosion of imperial ambition, religious zeal, and mercantile greed. The Spanish crown moved quickly. Backed by papal authority, they secured a series of legal declarations granting them dominion over any lands west of a certain meridian, an imaginary line drawn to divide the unknown world between Spain and Portugal. This agreement, formalized in the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, granted Portugal rights to lands east of the line, including Africa and eventually Brazil, and Spain to the west, the rest of the Americas. This papal partition, made without regard for the peoples living in these lands, laid the legal foundation for centuries of colonialism. The world, for the first time, was being divided by map and decree. Columbus himself returned to the New World in 3 subsequent voyages, 1493, 1498, and 1502, each marked by escalating ambition and deepening trouble. On his second voyage, he brought a massive fleet of 17 ships and over 1,200 men, including priests, artisans, and soldiers, the first colonizers. He expected to find vast riches and well-ordered cities. What he found instead was hardship, resistance from indigenous peoples, and growing unrest among his own men. The settlement of La Navidad, left behind during the first voyage, had been destroyed. Conflicts with the Taino escalated. Europeans responded with brutality, enslavement, massacres, forced tribute, and the spread of deadly diseases such as smallpox and influenza, to which the native populations had no immunity. Columbus's rule in Hispaniola quickly descended into mismanagement and cruelty. His obsession with finding gold led to increasingly harsh treatment of indigenous people, including a system of forced labor that would later evolve into the encomienda, a system of exploitation in which natives were entrusted to Spanish settlers, essentially legalizing slavery under a Christian banner. Reports of Columbus's tyranny, including from his own officers, reached Spain. In 1500, he was arrested and returned to Spain in chains. Though he was later pardoned, his prestige never fully recovered. Even in disgrace, however, Columbus had irreversibly changed the course of history. He had proven that westward voyages could yield land, peoples, and profit. He had bridged two hemispheres that had evolved in total isolation from each other for over 10,000 years. What followed was the Columbian Exchange, a vast and violent transfer of plants, animals, cultures, technologies, religions, and diseases between the old and new worlds. Maize, potatoes, and tomatoes flowed to Europe. Horses, wheat, iron tools, and Christianity swept into the Americas. But so too did slavery, conquest, smallpox, and cultural erasure. Columbus's legacy remains profoundly contested. For centuries, he was lionized in European and American histories as a heroic figure, the discoverer of the New World. Statues were erected, holidays declared, myths cemented, but in more recent decades, historians and indigenous communities have drawn attention to the devastating consequences of his actions: genocide, cultural destruction, and the initiation of the transatlantic slave trade. Columbus did not discover an empty world. He encountered thriving civilizations, rich in language, belief, and complexity, and helped begin their systematic dismantling. Ultimately, Columbus's voyage was not just a maritime gamble, it was the ignition of a global transformation. The world of 1492 had been fragmented into hemispheres. Within a generation, oceans became corridors, continents collided, and empires were born. Columbus never reached Asia, but he did something perhaps even more consequential. He shattered the geographic silence between East and West and ushered in a new, volatile world of connection, conflict, and change. As the 16th century dawned, Spain's imperial gaze turned inland. The Caribbean, once a new and fertile frontier, was quickly depleted. Gold was scarce, native populations decimated by disease and forced labor. What began as a burst of discovery was now morphing into conquest, and Spanish ambition demanded greater prizes. Whispers spread among colonists and court officials alike of a mighty kingdom on the mainland, far richer than anything the islands could offer. Its name, Mexico, was spoken with awe. Tales told of golden idols, towering cities, vast armies, and an emperor draped in feathers and jewels. And in 1519, a determined Spaniard named Hernan Cortes would sail toward that legend and rewrite the fate of two civilizations. Cortes was born in Isibawul, in Medellin, Spain, to a minor noble family. Restless and clever, he was educated in law before abandoning his studies to seek fortune in the New World. By his early 30s, he had become a seasoned figure in the Spanish Caribbean, serving as a soldier, notary, and landholder in Hispaniola, and later Cuba, where he grew wealthy through the brutal encomienda system. But wealth alone was not enough. Cortes hungered for glory, and in 1518, he was chosen to lead an expedition to the mainland of Central America, initially to establish trade and expand Spanish control. However, as he assembled ships and men, his ambition quickly outgrew the limits of his charter. He gathered a force of around 600 men, including sailors, soldiers, priests, translators, and Cuban natives, along with 16 horses, cannons, crossbows, and arquebuses, early firearms. The expedition was modest in size, especially compared to the massive empires they would soon face, but it was tightly organized, well-armed, and driven by a singular will. Cortes defied orders from the Cuban governor and set sail from Santiago de Cuba in February 1519. His unauthorized act was treason, but Cortes was banking on success. If he conquered new lands and brought home treasure, his disobedience would be forgiven. He made landfall on the coast of present-day Veracruz, where he began a campaign of alliances, manipulations, and demonstrations of power that would define his style of conquest. One of his earliest contacts came in the form of a remarkable woman, La Malinche, also known as Malintzin, or Dona Marina, a Nahua woman who spoke both Mayan and Nahuatl. She would become Cortes' interpreter, cultural guide, and later, his lover, bridging the yawning gap between Spanish ambition and Aztec understanding. Through her, Cortes navigated the complex web of Mesoamerican politics, exploiting divisions among indigenous nations who resented Aztec dominance. The Aztec Empire, ruled at the time by Emperor Moctezuma II, was a formidable power centered in Tenochtitlan, a massive city built on an island in Lake Texcoco, in the heart of present-day Mexico City. It was a marvel of urban engineering, with canals, temples, markets, and palaces, home to perhaps 200,000 people, larger than any European city at the time. But it was also an empire sustained by conquest, tribute, and ritual human sacrifice, which created a deep well of resentment among surrounding peoples. Cortes seized on this. He formed alliances with Totonacs, then the powerful Tlaxcolans, longtime enemies of the Aztecs. These native allies, numbering in the tens of thousands, would be crucial to the Spanish advance, in contrast to later myths of a small band of Europeans defeating the Aztec Empire alone. The reality was more complex. Cortes' conquest was a coalition war, with native fighters making up the vast majority of his forces. By late 1519, having founded the settlement of Villarica de la Vera Cruz, Cortes made a daring move. He burned his ships, preventing retreat, and binding his men to the campaign. He began the march inland toward Tenochtitlan, through valleys, mountains, and cities, filled with wonders and dangers. Along the way, Cortes was seen by some natives as a liberator, by others as a demon, and to many, simply as a mysterious and powerful figure, possibly even a god. Some indigenous accounts suggest that the Aztecs may have believed Cortes to be a figure of prophecy, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity said to return from the east. While modern historians debate the accuracy of this claim, what is certain is that Moctezuma was deeply cautious. Rather than confront Cortes on the battlefield, the emperor welcomed him to the capital in November 1519, offering gifts, lodging, and ambiguous diplomacy. It was one of history's most fateful welcomes. The Spanish and their allies were now inside the beating heart of the Aztec Empire, and Cortes had no intention of leaving. When Cortes and his men entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519, they were awestruck. The city, gleaming in the center of a vast lake, was unlike anything they had ever seen. Grand stone temples loomed over orderly causeways, bridges stretched across glistening water, and busy markets bustled with goods from across Mesoamerica. To many of the Spaniards, hardened veterans of war and plunder, it was a revelation, a new world metropolis, more sophisticated and wealthier than any European city they knew. And yet, beneath this wonder, the seeds of destruction were already sown. Cortes saw not a city to admire, but a prize to seize. Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor, had greeted Cortes with ceremonial grandeur, but uncertain intent. He offered hospitality and gifts, including gold, which inflamed the Spanish desire for conquest. Moctezuma, caught in a dilemma, tried to manage the foreign presence through diplomacy and divine appeasement. Was Cortés amortao, a conqueror, or something more? This uncertainty, coupled with the emperor's cautious policies, created confusion among the Aztec elite and discontent among the people. Meanwhile, Cortes exploited this hesitation. With strategic cunning, he took Moctezuma hostage within his own palace, effectively turning the emperor into a puppet while maintaining a facade of cooperation inside the imperial city. The Spanish soon began imposing their beliefs and authority. Crosses were erected atop Aztec temples, Christian rites performed, and local customs increasingly suppressed. Tensions ran high. The fragile illusion of peace shattered in May 1520, when Cortes, having temporarily left the city to confront a Spanish punitive force on the coast, returned to find that his deputy, Pedro de Alvarado, had ordered a massacre at the Toxcatel festival, slaughtering hundreds of unarmed Aztec nobles and priests. The motive was fear of an uprising, fear of Aztec ritual, fear of being overwhelmed. The massacre ignited full-scale rebellion. The city turned on the Spaniards and their allies with furious vengeance. Tenochtitlan, once a gilded host, became a deadly trap. Streets that had welcomed the Spaniards with flower petals were now barricaded with spears and fire. Moctezuma, still under Spanish control, attempted to quell the violence, but was met with stones and curses. According to Spanish accounts, he died shortly after, struck by his own people. Aztec sources, however, suggest that the Spanish murdered him, and the truth remains clouded by propaganda and conflict. By June 1520, Cortes' forces were under siege, food was scarce, morale broken, and the causeways were choked with Aztec warriors. The Spaniards decided to flee. On the moonless night of June 30th, 1520, they attempted a desperate escape, an event forever remembered as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Laden with stolen gold, they tried to slip out under cover of darkness, but were discovered. Aztec warriors attacked from canoes and causeways. Many Spaniards drowned or were captured and sacrificed. Over half the Spanish force perished, along with many native allies. Cortes wept beneath a tree as the survivors regrouped in the highlands. But the war was not over. After months of regrouping in Tlaxcala, where he forged an even stronger alliance with the Tlaxcalans, Cortes returned with a vengeance. By now, the Spaniards had realized the key to victory: siege warfare, native alliances, and biological devastation. Smallpox, introduced unwittingly during the earlier occupation, had begun to ravage the population of Tenochtitlan. The epidemic weakened not just bodies, but morale, governance, and ritual cohesion. The new emperor, Cuitlahuac, died of the disease, and his successor, Cuauhtémoc, inherited a city crippled and surrounded. In May 1521, Cortes launched the final assault on Tenochtitlan. His forces, numbering over 100,000 indigenous allies and a few hundred Spaniards, blockaded the lake, destroyed the aqueducts, and cut off food supplies. For 3 months, the city endured relentless siege and starvation as canals ran red with blood and temples became fortresses. The defenders fought with unmatched courage, resorting to hand-to-hand combat and building barricades from rubble. But the disparity in weaponry, disease, and numbers could not be overcome. On August 13, 1521, after 93 days of siege, Tenochtitlan fell. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, was captured while attempting to flee by canoe. He was brought before Cortes, defiant even in defeat. "I have done what was my duty," he is said to have declared. "Now take my dagger and finish me." Cortes refused to execute him immediately. But the empire had collapsed. The city was in ruins, its temples razed, its streets filled with corpses. What had once been the heart of the Aztec world was now reduced to rubble. The conquest of Tenochtitlan was one of the most dramatic and catastrophic events in world history. It marked the collapse of a civilization and the birth of New Spain, a colony that would become the hub of Spanish power in the Americas. The cultural, demographic, and spiritual genocide that followed would reshape the continent for centuries. And at the center of it all was Cortes, part conqueror, part opportunist, part symbol of an age where steel, strategy, and disease could bring down an empire. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked not only the end of the Aztec Empire but the dawn of a new, complex, and often contradictory era in the Americas. In the ruins of a city once revered as the Venice of the New World, the Spanish began to build Mexico City, capital of New Spain, atop the shattered temples and buried canals of the old. From its inception, this New World Order was a palimpsest of violence and vision, a colonial society forged by conquest, but sustained by cultural fusion, resistance, and survival. And at the heart of it all stood the legacy of Hernan Cortes and his conquest, a story immortalized, manipulated, and endlessly debated through the centuries. In the short term, the conquest unleashed a cascade of transformations across Mesoamerica. The Spanish established a firm grip over the former Aztec heartland, dividing land among soldiers, clergy, and settlers. They imposed Catholicism, building churches over temples and baptizing thousands of indigenous people, sometimes by persuasion, often by force. Indigenous codices were burned, traditional rituals outlawed, and native languages gradually marginalized. Yet, despite this cultural erasure, many local customs survived, adapted into hybrid practices that blended native and European beliefs, visible even today in Mexican art, food, and religion. The economic foundations of the colony were also violently restructured. The encomienda system, first formalized in the Caribbean, was expanded in New Spain. Spanish encomenderos were granted rights to extract tribute and labor from indigenous communities. Though not technically slavery, in practice it created a brutal system of exploitation, one that decimated populations, disrupted families, and transformed entire societies into cogs in the machinery of empire. In the centuries that followed, this system would evolve and eventually give way to a complex caste hierarchy that codified racial divisions across Spanish America, placing Peninsulares Spaniards born in Spain above Criollos, those born in the Americas mestizos and indigenous peoples courts himself became a mythologized figure, even during his lifetime. To some, he was a heroic explorer, bold, visionary, divinely favored. To others, he was a cunning manipulator, a ruthless invader who betrayed both indigenous allies and Aztec hospitality. His own letters to Emperor Charles V, known as the Cartas de Relation, were crafted to portray himself as a loyal subject guided by faith and reason, downplaying the bloodshed and exaggerating his strategic brilliance. These writings helped shape a narrative of justified conquest, one where Christian civilization triumphed over pagan barbarism. It was a narrative that endured for centuries, but history would not remain so kind. Later chroniclers, including indigenous writers like Francisco de San Anton, Jimel Pahin, and mestizo historians like Fernando de Alva Ixtilix Uxital, offered alternative perspectives. They wrote of the betrayal of Moctezuma, the suffering of their people, and the destruction of a golden age. The most famous and scathing critique came from Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar who condemned the conquest's brutality and denounced the Spanish for their treatment of the natives. His work, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, sparked debate across Europe and even led to reforms, though rarely enforced, in colonial policy. The memory of the conquest has remained deeply ambivalent in modern Mexico. For centuries, Cortés was both celebrated and scorned. Statues of him were erected in the 19th century, only to be vandalized or removed in the 20th and 21st. In some regions, he is remembered as a founding father of Mexican identity, in others, as a symbol of foreign domination and cultural genocide. The figure of La Malinche, his indigenous interpreter and companion, has also become a powerful and polarizing cultural symbol, reviled by some as a traitor, honored by others as a survivor and mother of the mestizo nation. More broadly, the conquest of the Aztec Empire became a template for future Spanish expeditions. Small bands of armed Europeans, backed by native allies and steeled by faith in their divine mission, would go on to dismantle the Inca Empire, subdue Maya cities, and establish a vast transatlantic empire stretching from Patagonia to California. The conquest of Mexico proved that European hegemony could be asserted not only by sword and gun, but through the manipulation of local politics, religion, and symbols. It was an early prototype of imperial strategy, one that would be refined across continents and centuries, and yet, the fall of the Aztec Empire was not the end of indigenous civilization. Despite the devastation, many cultures adapted, resisted, and endured. Native languages are still spoken, ancient traditions still practiced, temples still uncovered beneath the modern cities. In Mexico, August 13th, the day Tenochtitlan fell, is not just a memorial to defeat, but a testament to resilience. It reminds the world that what was lost was vast and sacred, but what survived remains rooted in the soil, blood, and memory of a people who never disappeared. Thus, the legacy of the conquest is not a closed chapter, but an open wound and a living debate, one that continues to shape Latin America's sense of history, justice, and identity. It invites us to question the narratives of heroism, to honor voices long silenced, and to reckon with the real cost of empire. While Hernán Cortés' conquest of the Aztec Empire had sent shockwaves through Europe and reconfigured the power structures of Mesoamerica, a parallel drama was unfolding thousands of miles to the south, high in the Andes Mountains. Here lay the Inca Empire, the largest and most sophisticated state ever to emerge in pre-Columbian South America, known as Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. It stretched over 2,500 miles along the spine of the continent, from modern-day Colombia to Chile. Governed from the mountain capital of Cusco, the empire was an astonishing feat of engineering, administration, and cultural integration. A realm of stone cities, vast road networks, terraced agriculture, and centralized power. But in 1532, it would be undone by a force unimaginably small by comparison. Fewer than 200 Spaniards under the command of a man named Francisco Pizarro's background was as unassuming as Cortes S. Born illegitimately in the Extremadura region of Spain, a rugged land that also produced Cortes and many other conquistadors, he grew up poor, illiterate, and ambitious. He first crossed the Atlantic as a young man, taking part in early expeditions to Panama. There he met Diego de Almagro and Hernando de Luque, with whom he formed a partnership to explore southward. Drawn by rumors of a rich kingdom in the mountains, where even common tools were made of gold, between 1524 and 1528, Pizarro led to exploratory journeys along the Pacific coast of South America. These expeditions were harsh and largely unprofitable, plagued by starvation, resistance, and disease. But on the third attempt, Pizarro reached Tumbes at the edge of the Inca realm, and glimpsed a society of enormous wealth and complexity. He returned briefly to Spain to secure royal approval. In 1529, Queen Isabel signed the Capitulación de Toledo, granting Pizarro the authority to conquer and govern any lands he discovered. This legal sanction transformed him from pirate to agent of empire. With this royal license, he assembled a tiny force minus 168 soldiers, 27 horses, 1 cannon, and returned to Peru. By then, the Inca Empire was on the brink of collapse. What Pizarro found upon arrival was a kingdom torn apart by civil war. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac had died of smallpox in 1527, a disease introduced by Europeans, years before any Spaniard reached the Andes. The epidemic also claimed the life of his designated heir, leaving 2 sons, Atahualpa and Huasca, to fight for the throne. After a brutal and bloody conflict that shattered the unity of the empire, Atahualpa emerged victorious, but his rule was still contested, his armies weary, and his people divided. The Spanish arrived at the precise moment when the Inca world was most vulnerable. In November 1532, Pizarro and his men marched into the highlands, reaching the town of Cajamarca, where Atahualpa was encamped with thousands of troops. The Inca emperor, unaware of the full danger the Spaniards posed, agreed to meet. The confrontation that followed would become one of the most astonishing and one-sided encounters in world history. Pizarro's men set a trap. When Atahualpa entered the plaza unarmed, carried on a litter, surrounded by nobles, the Spaniards launched a surprise ambush. Cannons fired, swords flashed, horses charged, all terrifying novelties to the Inca. Thousands of attendants were slaughtered, while Atahualpa himself was captured alive. In a single afternoon, without a battle in the traditional sense, Pizarro had decapitated the Inca command structure. The emperor, confused but composed, tried to negotiate. To buy his freedom, he promised a ransom of gold and silver, a room filled with gold as high as a man could reach, and 2 more rooms of silver. Over the next 8 months, temples and palaces across the empire were stripped bare. Artisans melted priceless artifacts into ingots to satisfy the Spanish greed. It was the largest ransom in recorded history, and it was not enough. After receiving the treasure, Pizarro put Atahualpa on trial, accusing him of idolatry and conspiring against the Spanish. In August 1533, he was executed. reportedly strangled by Garat after a last-minute baptism. The death of Atahualpa sent shockwaves through the Andes. Though his rule had been contested, he was still the symbolic heart of Inca authority. With him gone, resistance flared in some quarters, but disarray spread more quickly. Pizarro moved into Cusco, the imperial capital, with little organized resistance. The city fell, its temples looted, and the sacred Coricancha, center of Inca religion, was converted into a Christian church. A puppet emperor, Manco Inca, was installed, but real power lay with the conquistadors. What Pizarro had achieved was extraordinary and catastrophic. Like Cortes, he had leveraged a volatile political situation, superior weaponry, and the psychological impact of European warfare to dismantle a superpower. But unlike the more centralized assault on Tenochtitlan, the conquest of the Inca realm would continue in waves, with rebellions, betrayals, and brutal campaigns lasting for decades. The fall of the Inca Empire was not a singular event, but the opening act in a long, bitter transformation of the Andes, one that would leave a permanent scar across South America. The swift capture of Atahualpa and the seizure of Cusco might have seemed to seal the fate of the Inca Empire, but in reality, the conquest was only beginning. The Andes were vast and rugged, home to resilient peoples with centuries of experience, defending their land and culture. After the initial shock of Pizarro's lightning strike, pockets of fierce resistance emerged, led by Inca loyalists and local communities determined to reclaim their sovereignty. This prolonged struggle reveals the complexity of conquest. Far from a simple tale of Spanish dominance, it was a brutal saga of guerrilla warfare, diplomacy, betrayal, and cultural survival. Immediately after Atahualpa's death in 1533, Manco Inca Yupanqui was installed as a puppet ruler by the Spaniards. He was a young noble, seen as more pliable than other Inca claimants, and his cooperation gave the conquistadors a veneer of legitimacy. However, Manco harbored deep resentment against his new overlords. After a few years under Spanish domination, he escaped their control and in 1536 led a massive rebellion to retake Cusco. His forces, numbering thousands of indigenous warriors, laid siege to the city for nearly a year. The siege of Cusco was a testament to Inca military resilience and strategic skill, utilizing their knowledge of the terrain, traditional fortifications, and guerrilla tactics. Manco's forces inflicted heavy casualties on the Spanish and their indigenous allies. However, the Spaniards' superior weaponry, especially firearms, and cavalry, along with reinforcements sent from Panama, gradually turned the tide. The siege ultimately failed, forcing Manco to retreat into the remote Vilcabamba region, where he established the Neo-Inca state, a rump kingdom that resisted Spanish control for nearly 40 years. During this time, the Spanish solidified their hold over the former empire. The encomienda system was imposed with brutal efficiency, forcing indigenous people into labor in mines and plantations. The vast silver mines at Potosi, discovered in 1545, became the economic engine of the Spanish Empire, but at the cost of unimaginable human suffering. Indigenous laborers were subjected to the meta, a forced labor draft modeled on Inca systems, but far more exploitative. Death rates soared, and entire communities were devastated. Meanwhile, resistance took many forms beyond open warfare. Indigenous leaders engaged in diplomacy and negotiation, seeking to preserve land rights, and religious practices through petitions to colonial authorities. Others covertly maintained traditional rituals, languages, and governance structures beneath the surface of imposed Spanish rule. This cultural resilience laid the groundwork for enduring indigenous identity. The Spanish also faced challenges from internal rivalries. The relationship between Pizarro and his partner Diego de Almagro soured over claims to land and authority, leading to civil war among the conquistadors themselves. These conflicts weakened Spanish control temporarily, creating openings for Inca resurgence. Almagro briefly captured Cusco in 1537, but was defeated and executed in 1538. His followers continued guerrilla warfare in the region for years, often allying with indigenous groups. Religious conversion was another battleground. Spanish missionaries zealously sought to eradicate Inca religious practices, destroying temples, idols, and sacred texts. Yet, many indigenous communities syncretized their beliefs with Christianity, creating hybrid faiths that preserved elements of their cosmology. Under Christian symbolism, the Coricancha, once the golden temple of the sun god Inti, was converted into the Church of Santo Domingo, a stark symbol of conquest and cultural fusion. That the Neo-Inca state in Vilcabamba persisted as a symbol of indigenous sovereignty until 1572, when the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed by the Spanish. His death marked the formal end of Inca political autonomy, but not the end of resistance or cultural identity. Tales of Tupac Amaru's heroism and martyrdom inspired future indigenous movements, including the 18th century rebellion that bore his name. In conclusion, the Inca conquest was not a swift collapse, but a drawn-out saga of struggle and survival. It involved complex alliances, brutal warfare, systemic exploitation, and remarkable cultural endurance. The shadow of the Andes became a theater where indigenous peoples continually negotiated, resisted, and adapted to one of history's most transformative and devastating encounters. With the fall of the Neo-Inca state in 1572, Spanish authority was firmly established over the vast Andean highlands. Yet the transformation of this region was far from complete. The conquest did not simply erase the Inca world. Rather, it initiated a profound process of reconstruction, cultural synthesis, and colonial governance that would shape the Andes for centuries. In this third phase, we explore how the Spanish imposed their colonial order while indigenous peoples navigated, resisted, and redefined their identities under new circumstances. Economically, the Andes became a crucial pillar of the Spanish Empire, largely due to the exploitation of mineral wealth. The discovery of the silver mines of Potosi in 1545 transformed the global economy. Located at over 13,000 feet above sea level, Potosi was not only the richest silver deposit ever found, but also one of the largest urban centers in the Americas by the late 16th century. The extraction of silver required massive labor, mostly forced indigenous workers conscripted through the meta system. This system, adapted from Inca labor drafts but intensified under Spanish rule, exacted a devastating toll on local populations. Death, displacement, and social disintegration were widespread consequences. Yet the wealth fueled Spain's European ambitions and financed wars and palaces far from the Andes. Alongside economic exploitation came the consolidation of colonial administration. The Spanish established the Viceroyalty of Peru in 1542. Centered in Lima, a city founded by Francisco Pizarro himself. Lima became the political, religious, and cultural capital of Spanish South America. Through a bureaucracy staffed mostly by Spaniards and Criollos, American-born Spaniards, the crown exercised control over a vast and diverse territory. Spanish law and institutions, courts, municipalities, and the church replaced many indigenous governance systems. But indigenous elites often found ways to insert themselves within this framework. serving as intermediaries or local leaders. Religion played a transformative role in colonial society. Catholic missionaries, primarily Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, aggressively sought to convert indigenous populations. Mission churches were built atop former Inca temples. Christian festivals merged with native rites. The Jesuit reductions, especially in the eastern lowlands, became centers where indigenous people were gathered into organized communities under missionary supervision. Though often paternalistic and coercive, these efforts also facilitated the survival of some indigenous cultural forms within a new religious landscape. Despite these impositions, indigenous peoples continued to assert their identities. Many preserved their languages, such as Quechua and Aymara, which became lingua francas across the Andean highlands. Artistic expressions flourished in new forms, blending European and native motifs, visible in textiles, silverwork, and church decorations. In some areas, traditional forms of communal land tenure and social organization survived. Adapting to the pressures of colonial rule, the Andes also witnessed ongoing resistance. Periodic indigenous uprisings, from localized revolts to more ambitious attempts at autonomy, punctuated the colonial era. The memory of Inca rulers like Tupac Amaru and Tupac Katari fueled many such movements. The most famous was the 1780-1781 rebellion led by Tupac Amaru II, a mestizo leader who claimed descent from the Inca royal line. His uprising mobilized tens of thousands in a violent revolt against Spanish authority and the abuses of the colonial system. Though ultimately crushed, it left a lasting legacy of indigenous nationalism and resistance. Culturally and socially, the colonial Andes became a mosaic of identities. Mestizaje, the blending of indigenous, European, and African peoples, produced complex societies where race, class, and culture intersected in nuanced ways. Despite legal hierarchies and discrimination, indigenous traditions persisted alongside new influences, creating hybrid worlds that challenged simplistic notions of conquest and colonization. In sum, the colonial Andes were not merely a conquered land but a site of ongoing negotiation, adaptation, and resilience. The fall of the Inca Empire was the beginning of a long process that reshaped identities, economies, and cultures. This legacy continues to echo in contemporary Andean societies, where the echoes of empire and resistance remain vibrant. The early 15th century marked a profound turning point in human history, the dawn of an age in which the seas became highways of empire. For centuries, European powers had looked outward with curiosity, but it was only when Portugal and Spain marshaled the political will, technological innovation, and economic motivation that the age of maritime empires truly began. These two Iberian kingdoms, long embroiled in the Reconquista, emerged from centuries of religious war with a thirst for expansion, wealth, and glory. But their gaze now turned outward, toward the vast and mysterious oceans. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was built on centuries of gradual technological evolution and geographical curiosity. Key to this maritime revolution was the development of the caravel, a nimble, fast, and durable ship based on North African and Iberian designs. With its lateen sails, the caravel could tack against the wind, enabling sailors to explore coastlines and open seas with unprecedented confidence. Just as crucial were advancements in navigation, the widespread use of the magnetic compass, improvements in the astrolabe and cross-staff, and the refinement of Portolan charts that allowed mariners to determine latitude with far greater accuracy. These instruments didn't eliminate danger. but they gave European sailors the tools to push beyond the known. The spark was lit in Portugal, a small kingdom with limited land resources but a long Atlantic coastline and deep maritime heritage, under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator. Portugal established a school of navigation at Sagres and began sponsoring systematic exploration down the west coast of Africa. These early voyages, beginning in the 1420s, were driven by multiple goals: tapping into the trans-Saharan gold trade, finding a Christian ally in the fabled Prester John, and expanding access to African slave markets. But more than that, the Portuguese saw the Atlantic and African coast not as a boundary, but as an opportunity, a space to project power and wealth. Progress was slow but cumulative. In 1434, Gil-Eans rounded Cape Bajador, a milestone feared by sailors due to its dangerous currents and mythical sea monsters. As more capes were passed and maps filled in, the Portuguese pushed further, establishing trading posts and forging ties often by force with local African polities. By 1488, Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. This opened the possibility of reaching the fabled spice lands of the East by sailing around Africa, bypassing Muslim-controlled land routes through the Middle East and Central Asia. Meanwhile, Spain, having completed the Reconquista with the fall of Granada in 1492, was eager to match Portuguese successes. The Spanish crown, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, sought both to expand Christendom and enrich the treasury of a nascent empire. It was in this atmosphere that Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor inspired by the cosmography of Ptolemy and the writings of Marco Polo, proposed a bold plan to reach Asia by sailing west. Though dismissed by many as folly, Columbus secured Spanish backing after years of lobbying. His departure in August 1492 aboard the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria was not just a voyage of discovery, it was the birth cry of a global age. When he made landfall in the Bahamas, Columbus believed he had reached the East Indies, unaware that he had stumbled upon an entirely new hemisphere. Though not the first European to reach the Americas, that title belongs to the Norse. Columbus's voyage marked the beginning of sustained contact between Europe and the Americas, with world-changing consequences. The rivalry between Spain and Portugal quickly intensified. The two powers, eager to avoid open conflict, turned to the papacy to divide the non-European world. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, drawing an imaginary line through the Atlantic Ocean lands. To the west of the line belonged to Spain, those to the east to Portugal. Though deeply Eurocentric and largely ignorant of actual geography, this treaty had real consequences, shaping the linguistic and colonial divisions of the Americas and beyond. Thus began the Maritime Imperial Age, a period defined not by isolated voyages, but by the systematic expansion of European political and economic power overseas. Spain and Portugal would soon build the first global empires, stretching from Brazil to the Philippines, from the Andes to the Malaccan Straits. The seas were no longer a mystery. They were the battleground of ambition. By the early 1500s, the Atlantic was no longer a boundary, it had become a corridor of power. The Treaty of Tordesillas had divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal, and both nations wasted no time in transforming this legal fiction into imperial reality. What unfolded over the next several decades was a breathtaking geopolitical transformation. Two relatively small Iberian kingdoms began building empires that spanned oceans, conquered continents, and reshaped global trade, religion, and politics. this was not exploration for exploration's sake. It was conquest, exploitation, and colonization on a scale never before seen. The Portuguese Empire took root along the coasts of Africa and then leapfrogged into the Indian Ocean. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached Calicut on the southwestern coast of India after a perilous voyage around the Cape of Good Hope. His arrival in the Indian Ocean shocked the Islamic and Hindu trading networks that had dominated the region for centuries. Though the Portuguese arrived as mere newcomers, they quickly deployed their superior cannons, ships, and martial tactics to establish fortified trading posts, or feitorias, at key maritime choke points: Goa, Malacca, Mozambique, and Hormuz. These were not colonies in the traditional sense, but armed outposts that allowed the Portuguese to control spice routes and levy duties on passing trade. Portugal's strategy was to dominate trade by force, rather than by volume. Its empire was a series of nodes, strategically located ports, backed by ships and guns, sustained by small but effective garrisons and alliances with local rulers. The Portuguese seized Malacca in 1511, gaining control over one of the most important straits in Asia. And by 1557, they had established a foothold in Macau, opening access to Chinese markets. In Africa and Brazil, they focused on sugar plantations and the slave trade, laying the foundation for the transatlantic economy that would soon define the Americas. Meanwhile, the Spanish Empire pursued a different model: territorial conquest and colonization. The Spanish crown authorized conquistadors, private military entrepreneurs, to explore, subjugate, and govern new lands in the name of the monarchy and the church. Following Columbus's expeditions, Spanish efforts rapidly expanded across the Caribbean, where they established settlements on Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. But the real prize lay on the mainland. In the 1510s and 1520s, Hernan Cortes and Francisco Pizarro led conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires, giving Spain access to immense stores of gold, silver, and labor. These conquests were followed by waves of settlers, missionaries, and administrators who sought not only wealth, but also the spiritual conquest of native peoples. The Catholic Church played a central role in the Spanish imperial project, with missionaries establishing parishes, schools, and religious courts throughout the Americas. The Spanish believed they were creating a new Spain, a mirror of European society complete with universities, cathedrals, and legal codes. In cities like Mexico City, Lima, and Quito, European architecture rose atop indigenous ruins, physically manifesting the imperial hierarchy to administer their growing dominions. Spain established a complex colonial bureaucracy. The Viceroyalty of New Spain, 1535, and the Viceroyalty of Peru, 1542, functioned as centralized administrative divisions, governed by viceroys appointed by the king. These officials oversaw military defenses, tax collection, and the enforcement of Spanish law. Meanwhile, the Council of the Indies, based in Madrid, coordinated imperial policy across the Atlantic. While impressive on paper, this system was plagued by corruption, communication delays, and regional power struggles, yet it kept the machinery of empire grinding forward. The wealth extracted from these colonies was staggering. Potosi and Zacatecas produced tons of silver, which fueled the global economy and allowed Spain to dominate European politics for much of the 16th century. This silver flood connected the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia in a vast web of trade. The earliest iteration of globalization, Spanish silver made its way to China via Manila galleons, paying for silk, porcelain, and spices. African slaves, forcibly taken to the Americas, labored on sugar plantations that sweetened European tables, and European goods flowed into the colonies in exchange for tropical products like tobacco, cacao, and cochineal. This era also marked a new kind of empire, one measured not in contiguous territory but in control over key maritime routes, transoceanic supply chains, and hybrid societies. Spain and Portugal pioneered this model, which would later be imitated and modified by rising powers like the Dutch, English, and French. But the Iberians were the first to prove that a nation's power could be projected not just across rivers or mountain passes, but across entire oceans. Still, these maritime empires came at enormous human cost. Indigenous societies were decimated, African communities ravaged by the slave trade, and millions lived under systems of forced labor and cultural suppression. Yet, amid the brutality, new societies emerged, multicultural, multilingual, and often resilient. The legacy of Spain and Portugal's maritime empires is one of contradiction, grandeur, and cruelty, wealth and devastation, innovation and oppression, an enduring tapestry woven across the oceans. By the mid-16th century, the maritime empires of Spain and Portugal had created a planetary network of ports, colonies, and trading posts, a system of connectivity so vast and dynamic that historians often call it the world's first truly global economy. For the first time in human history, goods, people, ideas, and diseases circulated between all inhabited continents. It was an era of unprecedented exchange, commercial, cultural, and religious, but also of systemic exploitation, profound inequality, and catastrophic demographic collapse for indigenous populations. At the center of this global network was the Spanish silver economy, which served as the engine driving the New World Order. Silver extracted from Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia, and Zacatecas, in present-day Mexico, did not remain in the Americas. It was shipped across the Atlantic to Seville, the gateway of Spanish imperial trade, and from there dispersed throughout Europe to pay for goods, wars, and debts. But a significant portion traveled in another direction across the Pacific, on board the famous Manila galleons. Beginning in 1565, these vast ships connected Acapulco to Manila in the Philippines, carrying silver from the New World to Asia in exchange for silk, porcelain, spices, and other luxury goods. This trade route linked China, India, and Japan to the Americas via Spanish colonial infrastructure, creating an economic triangle that spanned half the globe. The Portuguese played a parallel role in this web, building their empire around a system of fortified coastal enclaves and oceanic routes stretching from Lisbon to Goa, Malacca, Macau, and Nagasaki. Unlike the Spanish, who governed vast inland territories, the Portuguese largely controlled strategic maritime gateways. From these posts, they extracted wealth, imposed monopolies, and served as brokers between Asian, African, and European markets. Their trade in spices, textiles, ivory, and slaves created a constant flow of goods that enriched the crown and fueled competition among European powers. By the 1530s, Portuguese India was not just a trading zone, it was an imperial experiment in cross-cultural governance, where European, Muslim, Hindu, and Chinese merchants coexisted, negotiated, and occasionally clashed. While commerce defined the economic backbone of these empires, religion became their soul, or at least their justification. Both Spain and Portugal claimed to be advancing the Christian mission, converting heathens, and spreading the faith to the ends of the earth. In practice, This meant a complex mix of forced conversion, missionary zeal, and cultural negotiation. In the Americas, entire populations were baptized en masse, often with little understanding of the doctrines imposed upon them. The Catholic Church became an arm of empire, building monasteries, cathedrals, and schools across the colonies. Orders such as the Jesuits, Dominicans, and Franciscans not only preached but documented local languages, trained indigenous elites, and debated the morality of conquest. One of the most remarkable religious projects of the age occurred in Asia, where the Jesuits spearheaded a missionary push into Japan and China. Figures like Francis Xavier and later Matteo Ricci adopted unprecedented approaches to evangelism, learning local languages, engaging with Confucian scholars, and attempting to present Christianity as compatible with traditional philosophies. While their success was mixed, these efforts represented a cultural bridge between East and West, rooted in respect, at least at first, for local intellectual traditions. But this web of contact also unleashed devastation. The Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of organisms between the Old and New Worlds, brought wheat, horses, cattle, and sugarcane to the Americas, while maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco spread to Europe, Asia, and Africa. Yet perhaps the most consequential transfer was disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated indigenous populations across the Americas, with mortality rates in some areas exceeding 90%. This demographic collapse paved the way for African slavery, as European colonists turned to the transatlantic slave trade to supply labor for sugar plantations, silver mines, and tobacco fields. The Atlantic slave trade, initially dominated by the Portuguese and later joined by the Spanish, laid the foundations of a system that would enslave over 12 million Africans in the coming centuries. The early stages of this trade began with Portuguese outposts in West Africa, where African rulers participated in and were eventually victimized by the demand for captives. These enslaved individuals were packed into ships and sold in brutal conditions across the Americas. The triangular trade of slaves, sugar, and silver became the backbone of colonial wealth and human suffering alike. Despite its violence, the global web fostered cultural hybridity. In Latin America, indigenous, African, and European traditions interwove into new identities. In Asia, European knowledge systems mingled with Chinese and Indian science, often sparking mutual curiosity. The foods, fashions, and artistic forms of distant lands influenced one another in subtle ways. A new global consciousness was beginning to emerge, one rooted in commerce, empire, and the movement of peoples, willingly or by force. This first wave of globalization laid the groundwork for a modern world, a world linked by oceanic trade routes, shared diseases, imperial rivalries, and entangled economies. Spain and Portugal, once marginal kingdoms on Europe's western fringe, now sat at the center of an imperial vortex. But their dominance would not last unchallenged. On the horizon, new maritime powers, the Dutch, the English, the French, were preparing to join the race, armed with new ambitions and their own brutal calculus. As the 16th century waned, the Atlantic powers of Spain and Portugal appeared invincible. Their armadas ruled the seas, their colonies poured out gold and silver, and their faith carried the imprimatur of Rome. Yet in the wings, to rising northern powers, England and the Dutch Republic were preparing to challenge the Iberian monopoly. Fueled by Protestant zeal, economic ambition, and maritime innovation, they would turn the tide of empire and lay the foundation for a new age of global competition, commerce, and colonization. England's initial forays into overseas expansion were hesitant, fragmented, and often chaotic. The country had lagged behind Iberian rivals in navigational expertise, shipbuilding, and global reach. But a shift began in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, as Protestant England faced growing tensions with Catholic Spain. Its ambitions took on a distinctly anti-Spanish and anti-papal tone. The English crown began to support, sometimes publicly, often covertly, privateers, seafaring entrepreneurs, authorized to attack enemy vessels. These men were not mere pirates, though the line was thin. They were state-sanctioned disruptors of Spain's Atlantic supremacy. Among the most famous was Sir Francis Drake, who embodied England's emergent maritime daring. In the 1570s and 1580s, Drake terrorized Spanish shipping across the Caribbean and Pacific, capturing gold-laden galleons and sacking ports from Cartagena to Callao. In 1577 to 1580, he completed a circumnavigation of the globe, only the second in history, plundering Spanish holdings along the way. Drake returned to England a national hero, knighted by Elizabeth herself aboard his ship, the Golden Hind. His voyage not only humiliated Spain but announced England's arrival on the global stage. This policy of maritime harassment reached its crescendo in 1588, when Spain launched the Armada, a massive fleet intended to invade and subdue England. The English Navy, smaller but more agile and better armed with long-range cannon, scattered the Armada in a legendary series of battles aided by stormy weather. The victory was more than tactical, it was symbolic. Protestant England, under a queen excommunicated by the Pope, had defied and defeated the most powerful Catholic empire in the world. The door to empire was now ajar. Across the North Sea, an even more dramatic transformation was underway. The Dutch Republic, forged in revolt against Spanish Habsburg rule, became a dynamic maritime power almost overnight. In 1581, the northern provinces of the Netherlands declared independence from Spain, triggering the long 80 Years' War. As they fought for survival on land, the Dutch mastered the seas. By the early 17th century, they had built the largest merchant fleet in Europe. Supported by sophisticated navigation, efficient shipyards, and a powerful financial sector centered in Amsterdam, the Dutch viewed trade as both a weapon and a strategy. In 1602, they founded the Dutch East India Company (VOC), the world's first multinational corporation backed by shareholder investment and a government charter. Armed with both cannon and capital, the VOC quickly muscled into Portuguese trading zones across the Indian Ocean. They seized Malacca, outflanked rivals in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and established Batavia, modern Jakarta, as the hub of their spice empire. The company operated its own navy, minted its own currency, and made treaties and wars, effectively becoming a state within a state. At the same time, the Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, aimed at disrupting Spanish and Portuguese shipping in the Americas and West Africa. Dutch privateers, known as sea beggars, raided Spanish fleets and outposts, and by mid-century, the Dutch had carved out colonies in Suriname, the Caribbean, and even Brazil briefly. Their Atlantic empire was more fragmented than their Asian holdings, but it played a crucial role in the slave trade, sugar production, and global finance. What distinguished both England and the Netherlands from their Iberian predecessors was not merely religion or tactics, it was flexibility and innovation. While Spain and Portugal clung to older feudal and religious models of imperial authority, the northern powers harnessed capital markets, joint stock companies, and middle-class entrepreneurialism, Their empires were not purely royal projects, but commercial enterprises that depended on risk-sharing, investor confidence, and legal contracts. This shift marked the beginning of the corporate colonial model that would dominate the next phases of global empire. And while both nations were ardently Protestant, their religious motives were often more political than evangelical. Unlike the Spaniards or Portuguese, who saw conversion as essential to their civilizing mission, the English and Dutch were less focused on souls and more on markets. They sought to undermine Catholic hegemony, yes, but also to open new trade routes, build new plantations, and gain access to gold, spices, and slaves, often through brutal means. Still, for all their pragmatism, the English and Dutch were not without ideological justification. They believed they were bringing liberty, industry, and Protestant truth to benighted lands. English pamphlets mocked Spanish cruelty, particularly after the infamous Black Legend, spread tales of Iberian atrocities in the New World, and portrayed English colonization as morally superior. In practice, English and Dutch colonies would prove no less exploitative. But in this period, their rhetoric gave them a potent ideological edge. As the 17th century dawned, it was clear that the age of exploration had entered a new phase. No longer just a story of Iberian dominance, it had become a multipolar contest, with Protestant powers challenging the old Catholic empires, not just with swords and cannons, but with banks, books, and brigs. The oceans were no longer controlled by a few, they had become the playing field for a global imperial free-for-all. The early 17th century witnessed a fundamental shift in how imperial power was conceived, organized, and expanded. While the Iberian empires had been driven largely by dynastic ambition and papal authority, the English and Dutch carved out their global presence using corporate structures, merchant capital, and a decentralized approach to colonization. Their empires were not forged solely by kings and queens, but by chartered companies, speculators, and settlers, creating a very different kind of global empire, one defined by trade, profit, and plantation labor in England. The most notable instrument of this new imperial model was the Virginia Company. Chartered in 1606, this joint stock company, composed of investors from London and the countryside, was granted sweeping powers to settle and govern English territories in North America. Its first significant success came in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown in the Chesapeake Bay region, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. The colony struggled in its early years, plagued by disease, starvation, and conflict with indigenous peoples. Yet the discovery that tobacco could thrive in the Virginia climate transformed its fortunes. By the 1620s, tobacco exports were booming, and the demand for labor surged first among indentured English servants and, increasingly, through the transatlantic slave trade. In tandem with Virginia, other English colonies took shape: Plymouth 1620, Massachusetts Bay 1630, Maryland 1632, and Barbados 1627. Each had distinct origins, some founded by religious dissenters seeking refuge, others by profit-seeking entrepreneurs, but all shared a dependence on export-oriented economies. In the Caribbean, the Sugar Revolution brought explosive wealth and brutality. Barbados and later Jamaica became vital nodes in the English imperial system, where enslaved Africans were worked to death under a regime of near-constant violence. Here, the English Empire revealed the same dark underbelly as its Iberian predecessors. The vast accumulation of wealth built upon coerced labor, racial hierarchy, and the commodification of human beings. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, the Dutch, Republic pursued a parallel strategy with even more astonishing commercial efficiency. The Dutch East India Company (VOC) had already established a firm grip over much of the Indonesian archipelago, displacing the Portuguese from spice-rich territories and constructing a maritime empire anchored in Batavia. But the Dutch were equally active in the Atlantic. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company founded New Amsterdam on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, a colony designed not as a religious refuge or military outpost, but as a profit-driven commercial hub. Dutch traders exported furs, imported enslaved Africans, and welcomed a remarkable degree of religious and cultural pluralism. Jews, Catholics, Huguenots, and Lutherans all lived under the pragmatic umbrella of Dutch tolerance. So long as commerce thrived beyond North America, the Dutch took Suriname, established posts in Curaçao and St. Eustatius, and briefly controlled parts of northeastern Brazil. Their interest in Africa also deepened. By mid-century, they seized Elmina Castle from the Portuguese and entrenched themselves in the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, becoming major players in the slave trade. Their African outposts became crucial waypoints for provisioning ships and trafficking captives across the Atlantic. In 1652, the VOC established a small settlement at the Cape of Good Hope, intended as a refreshment station for Dutch vessels bound for Asia. It would later evolve into the powerful Cape Colony, setting the stage for centuries of Dutch and then British influence in southern Africa. What distinguished both the English and Dutch efforts was their deep entanglement with private capital. Colonies were not merely expressions of state power, they were financial investments. The Dutch Republic led the world in capital markets, boasting the first modern stock exchange and complex mechanisms for maritime insurance. The VOC itself became the most valuable company in history, at one point worth more than some European states. The English were not far behind. Wealthy merchants in London, Bristol, and Liverpool financed expeditions, purchased shares in trading companies, and reaped enormous dividends from sugar, tobacco, and slave labor. This financial orientation shaped the nature of colonial governance. Both the English and Dutch relied on governors, company boards, and colonial assemblies rather than absolute royal authority. In places like New England, local town meetings and elected councils formed the backbone of colonial self-rule, establishing traditions that would later fuel revolutions. In Dutch colonies, burgher councils and merchant courts ensured that commercial interests remained supreme, often at the expense of centralized control. This autonomy made colonies more flexible, more responsive to local conditions, and at times more independent than the empires that spawned them anticipated. But these empires were not without resistance. Indigenous peoples from the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia to the Khoikhoi of South Africa fought back against European encroachment. The Dutch wars in Java, the English wars with the Algonquians, and uprisings in Caribbean plantations all revealed the contested, unstable nature of colonial control. Far from being smooth conquests, many of these ventures were fragile, held together by violence, negotiation, and opportunism. Still, by the mid-17th century, the Dutch and English empires had established a new imperial paradigm, one based not on papal blessings or divine monarchs, but on companies, contracts, and colonies run like businesses. It was empire as enterprise, and its consequences, both for Europe and the wider world, were just beginning to unfold. By the mid-17th century, the age of exploration had given birth not just to trade routes and colonies, but to a fierce and violent global rivalry among Europe's rising powers. The English and Dutch, no longer content to nibble at the fringes, of Iberian dominance, now sought to displace it altogether. What followed was not a mere competition of merchant fleets or maps, but a series of full-scale imperial wars, battles fought on sea and land, across continents, and in the holds of slave ships and the fields of sugar plantations. Trade, once seen as a route to peace and prosperity, became inseparable from conquest, enslavement, and imperial war. The Dutch-Portuguese War, 1602 to 1663, offers one of the clearest examples of this transformation. What began as commercial rivalry quickly escalated into a global conflict, as the Dutch Republic fought for independence from Spain, which then ruled Portugal in a dynastic union. It also launched a series of aggressive campaigns to seize Portuguese territories abroad. Dutch fleets sailed into the Indian Ocean, wresting control of Malacca, Ceylon, and much of Indonesia. In the South Atlantic, they captured strategic ports like Luanda in Angola and Recife in Brazil, challenging Portuguese dominance in both the sugar trade and the Atlantic slave trade. Though Portugal eventually recovered Brazil with Spanish help, it permanently lost control over many of its key eastern ports. The result was a fractured Iberian Empire and a commercial windfall for the Dutch. The English, too, were becoming bolder and more aggressive. Their victories over the Spanish Armada emboldened them to establish permanent colonies. But as wealth from sugar, tobacco, and slavery poured in, they began to engage in the same kind of militarized competition that had marked Iberian expansion. The Caribbean, in particular, became a theater of endless imperial conflict. Island after island changed hands in violent skirmishes. Jamaica was taken from Spain in 1655. Barbados, Antigua, and Montserrat became heavily fortified English outposts. The Dutch, for their part, focused on St. Eustatius, Curacao, and Suriname, turning them into critical hubs for arms smuggling, sugar export, and the provisioning of slaving voyages. The nature of warfare in this period was changing as well. Unlike earlier crusade-style conquests, these wars were increasingly corporate and mercantile in character. Naval battles were not just about national pride. They were about controlling shipping lanes, choke points, and customs duties. Port cities became fortified compounds. Navies expanded dramatically, with the Dutch and English building vast fleets of warships to protect convoys, attack enemies, and escort merchantmen. Military technology advanced rapidly. Line-of-battle tactics, improved naval artillery, and coordinated fleet movements became standard practice, culminating in titanic confrontations like the four Anglo-Dutch Wars, 1652 to 1784, a long series of clashes for control of trade, colonies, and the seas. But war was not limited to open battle. Economic warfare became a tool of empire. The English Navigation Acts, passed in the 1650s and expanded over the next century, aimed to exclude the Dutch from profitable trade routes by forcing goods bound for English ports to travel only on English ships. This mercantilist policy inflamed tensions and spurred further conflict, including the First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652 to 1654, fought almost entirely at sea. Though peace treaties were signed, the wars resumed again and again, with each power seeking to dominate the lifeblood of their empires, the flow of silver, sugar, and slaves. At the heart of this contest was the plantation economy. Sugar, in particular, was transforming from a luxury good into a staple of European consumption, and it required immense labor. The Dutch and English alike turned to the transatlantic slave trade, not as a moral dilemma, but as a strategic necessity. Fortresses on the West African coast, like Elmina, Cape Coast Castle, and James Island became supply stations in a brutal network that trafficked millions of African captives to the Americas. These slaves powered the sugar mills of Barbados, the tobacco fields of Virginia, and the rice plantations of the Carolinas. It was in this crucible of imperial capitalism and racial violence that the modern global economy began to take shape. The enormous wealth generated by these systems flowed not just into royal treasuries but into joint stock companies, private banks, stock exchanges, and merchant houses. Amsterdam and London rose as global financial capitals, filled with shipowners, insurers, and investors whose fortunes were built on transoceanic violence. Stock in the VOC and English East India Company was traded like gold, even as their ships carried cannon, cargo, and coerced labor across the world. These were not just empires of exploration, they were empires of exploitation, and their commercial logic would reshape global geopolitics for centuries to come. And yet, for all their might, these new empires remained fragile, built on shifting sands of alliance, rebellion, and resource exhaustion. Indigenous resistance, enslaved uprisings, and inter-imperial wars kept their foundations unstable. But by the close of the 17th century, one thing was clear: the Iberian monopoly on global exploration had ended. A new world order was emerging, one defined not by papal bulls and conquistadors, but by corporate fleets, colonial assemblies, and financial speculation. The age of exploration had become the age of empire. The most devastating consequence of European exploration was not the clash of swords, the thunder of muskets, or even the seizure of gold. It was something invisible, insidious, and inescapable: disease. When Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they brought with them more than ambitions, technology, and Christianity. They carried microbes. These pathogens, long endemic in Europe, were utterly foreign to the immune systems of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and their impact would be catastrophic. In what historian Alfred Crosby termed the Columbian Exchange, the transference of biological agents between the old and new worlds initiated a demographic disaster on a scale previously unimagined. The Americas before 1492 were home to tens of millions of people, diverse cultures, ranging from the Inca of the Andes and the Mexica Aztecs of Mesoamerica to the Taíno of the Caribbean, and countless smaller societies scattered across the North and South American continents. These civilizations had advanced agriculture, architecture, social hierarchies, and trade networks, but they had been biologically isolated from Afro-Eurasia for over 10,000 years. As a result, diseases that had become common childhood illnesses in Europe, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and whooping cough, had no counterpart in the Americas, and no population-level immunity. When Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, he unknowingly launched one of the greatest pandemics in human history. Within mere decades, entire societies were wiped out by pathogens carried on the breath, skin, and belongings of Europeans, not necessarily through intentional malice, though some later episodes involved deliberate infection, but through sheer biological exposure. The Taíno people of Hispaniola, who numbered nearly 1 million at first contact, were reduced to fewer than 1,000 by the mid-1500s. On the mainland, when Hernán Cortés and his few hundred Spaniards entered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, in 1519 they encountered a bustling metropolis of over 200,000 people. By 1521, as Spanish forces laid siege to the city, smallpox broke out, killing the Aztec emperor and decimating the population. Hastening the Spanish victory more than any cannon or cavalry charge, the pattern repeated itself with chilling regularity. Inca resistance in the Andes was crippled when an outbreak of smallpox reached Peru before Francisco Pizarro's conquest, possibly transmitted via earlier expeditions. Across the Americas, villages were depopulated, societies collapsed, and oral traditions were interrupted. In some regions, 90% or more of the native population died within a century of contact. It was a biological apocalypse, and it cleared the way for European colonization on a scale that would have been impossible otherwise. The collapse of indigenous populations not only removed military resistance, but also shattered political cohesion, disrupted agriculture, and led to spiritual crises. As traditional cosmologies failed to explain the devastation, European colonists interpreted this catastrophe through a providential lens. Many believed that the near-instantaneous death of the native peoples was a divine endorsement of their expansion, a sign that God had prepared the land for Christian rule. In truth, the pandemic was not an act of divine will, but of biological asymmetry, the unintended consequence of ecological isolation, imperial ambition, and the movement of people across oceans. The irony is profound. The same ships that carried priests and plunder also carried fleas, viruses, and airborne particles that would shape the fate of entire continents. And yet, while disease decimated indigenous populations, it also created labor shortages that would soon fuel another horrific consequence of the Columbian exchange, the Atlantic slave trade. The demographic vacuum in the Americas would not remain empty for long. It would be filled by millions of Africans, forcibly transported across the ocean to become the backbone of the plantation economies that would dominate the next phase of European expansion. But before that, the exchange would accelerate animals, plants, people, pathogens, and cultures tumbling between hemispheres in a torrent of transformation. The old and new worlds, once separated by tens of millions of years of evolution, were now entangled, and nothing, anywhere, would ever be the same again. If the microbial invasion of the Americas brought devastation, the botanical exchange that followed reshaped diets, economies, and ecosystems across the globe. The Columbian exchange was not just a one-way flow of disease and conquest, was a complex biological revolution, marked by the movement of crops and animals between continents. In many ways, the most enduring legacies of the age of exploration lie not in empires or battles, but in what people began to eat and where. Thought from the New World to the Old, a tidal wave of previously unknown crops transformed European, African, and Asian agriculture. Among the most influential was maize corn. Native to Mesoamerica, corn was a cornerstone of indigenous diets and rituals. After 1492, it rapidly spread throughout the Old World, reaching West Africa, the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and eventually East Asia. In many of these regions, corn became a staple food, especially for the poor. It was easy to grow, adapted to various climates, and offered high yields. In sub-Saharan Africa, maize helped support population growth and even reshaped settlement patterns. Potatoes, domesticated in the Andes and beloved by the Inca, had an even more dramatic impact. Introduced to Europe in the late 16th century, the potato faced initial resistance. It grew underground and was viewed with suspicion, sometimes associated with disease or considered fit only for animals. But by the 18th century, it had become a lifeline. In places like Ireland, Poland, and Germany, potatoes fueled population booms. Their caloric density, coupled with their adaptability, allowed Europe to feed millions more people than before, setting the stage for urbanization, industrialization, and, eventually, modern demographic expansion. Then came the tomato, another American native, though it was first viewed as ornamental or even poisonous in parts of Europe. By the 17th century, it had begun to revolutionize cuisines. Imagine Italian cooking without tomatoes, no marinara, no pizza sauce, no sun-dried delicacies. The same can be said for chili peppers, which originated in Mesoamerica but quickly spread to India, Southeast Asia, and China, where they were embraced with astonishing speed. Today, chili is a defining feature of regional dishes from Sichuan to Goa, from Thailand to Mexico, all thanks to transoceanic contact. Likewise, cacao, once consumed only by elite Mesoamericans in bitter sacred drinks, was transformed into a sweetened European commodity and spread across the globe. Vanilla, cassava, pineapples, and peanuts also made their way from the Americas into Old World economies. Cassava, in particular, became critical in Africa. It provided reliable calories even in poor soils and drought-prone areas, though it had to be carefully processed to remove toxic cyanide compounds. But the flow of plants went both ways, from the Old World to the New. European colonists brought their own dietary and agricultural norms, forcibly imposed on the ecosystems of the Americas. They introduced wheat, which became central to colonial economies and symbolic of European civilization. Rice followed, especially to the American South, where enslaved Africans, already familiar with rice cultivation, were forced to farm it under brutal conditions. Barley, oats, and rye were planted in cooler climates, helping recreate the European landscape in distant colonies. And then there were the bananas, plantains, sugarcane, and coffee, tropical crops that came to define the plantation economies of the Caribbean and South America. Sugarcane, introduced to the New World by the Spanish and Portuguese, quickly became a drug crop, addictive, profitable, and incredibly laboring. Sugar drove the expansion of slavery, the carving of jungles into fields, and the construction of global trade routes connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Coffee, initially from East Africa and Arabia, found fertile ground in Brazil and the Caribbean, fueling social rituals and capitalist commerce alike. Bananas and plantains, originally African and Asian, also took root in the New World, changing local diets and ecosystems. These transformations were not neutral. Plants were often introduced in service of empire to feed soldiers, support settlers, or enrich merchants. Crops altered land use patterns, sometimes replacing diverse indigenous agriculture with monocultures that depleted soils and required constant labor. In some cases, the very success of these crops triggered ecological collapse, as in Haiti, where sugar plantations deforested entire regions. Still, the exchange of plants also led to hybrid cuisines and cultural fusion. In Mexico, indigenous maize-based dishes absorbed Spanish-introduced pork and cheese. In West Africa, cassava became the base of fufu, while peanuts were transformed into stews. In Southeast Asia, chilies added fire to traditional recipes, and in Europe, chocolate and vanilla became luxuries inseparable from the idea of dessert. Food became the most intimate expression of globalization, a daily reminder that the world had changed. The Columbian Exchange altered not just bodies and diets, but the identity of whole regions. Over time, it blurred the lines between old and new worlds. A European breakfast of coffee, sugar, and bread might feature products from Africa, South America, and the Middle East. An African dinner could include cassava from the Andes, peppers from Mexico, and rice from Asia. This culinary entanglement was as permanent as it was profound, and it revealed that the age of exploration was not only about discovery, but about irreversible entanglement. While crops and diseases shaped the biological and demographic landscapes of the early modern world, another class of participants in the Columbian exchange was equally transformative: animals. The deliberate and accidental movement of beasts across the Atlantic reshaped ecosystems, revolutionized economies, and altered cultures on both sides of the ocean. European domesticated animals, long embedded in their societies for labor, sustenance, warfare, and identity, arrived in the Americas with dramatic consequences. Where the wheel failed to travel, the hoof conquered. Before European arrival, the Americas lacked many of the domesticated animals common in Eurasia. There were no horses, cattle, pigs, goats, sheep, or chickens. The primary domesticated animals in the Americas included the dog, the llama and alpaca in the Andes, the turkey in Mesoamerica, and the guinea pig. This absence meant that indigenous agriculture, transport, and warfare developed along different lines than in Europe and Asia. The sudden influx of European animals into this biological vacuum was therefore ecologically explosive. The most symbolic and revolutionary animal introduced was the horse, brought over by Spanish conquistadors. Horses had not roamed the Americas for 10,000 years. Their ancient ancestors had gone extinct at the end of the last ice age. Reintroduced by Europeans, horses not only gave the Spanish a psychological and tactical edge in warfare. Imagine facing mounted warriors for the first time with no cultural reference for such a thing. But they also profoundly transformed indigenous societies. Nowhere was this more evident than on the Great Plains of North America. By the 17th and 18th centuries, escaped or traded horses had been adopted by various Native American groups, including the Comanche, Lakota, and Cheyenne. These tribes, previously agricultural or semi-sedentary, became nomadic horse cultures, redefining mobility, hunting, and warfare. The ability to follow bison herds across vast distances led to the emergence of powerful equestrian societies that would dominate the plains for over a century. The horse became a symbol of prestige, freedom, and transformation, an animal that had arrived with the invaders but was appropriated and mastered by those they had come to conquer. Other animals brought more subtle, though no less far-reaching, impacts. Pigs, for instance, were introduced early and proved to be the feral vanguard of colonization, reproducing quickly and eating almost anything. Pigs escaped captivity and ran wild in forests and fields, rooting up indigenous crops and disrupting native ecosystems. In places like the Caribbean and the southeastern US, wild pigs became both a nuisance and a new food source, often clashing with native farming practices and encouraging settler hunting expeditions. Cattle and sheep, meanwhile, brought pasture-based agriculture to the Americas. The Spanish introduced herding economies to places like Mexico, the Andes, and the Pampas of Argentina, where vast ranches, haciendas and estancias became the foundation of rural economies and social hierarchies. In these environments, the land was reshaped, forests cleared, grasslands sown with European species, and indigenous foodways replaced by European animal husbandry. These livestock economies also required forced labor, often enslaved Africans or exploited indigenous workers, and helped entrench systems of inequality that would last for centuries. Animals were not merely tools of economy and subsistence, they were also vectors of cultural imposition. The European model of domesticated animals as property, subject to fencing, branding, and slaughter, clashed with many indigenous worldviews, which saw animals as kin, spirits, or part of a communal landscape. The replacement of native fauna with European species was therefore both literal and symbolic, a biological conquest that mirrored the cultural one. But the influence of the Columbian exchange wasn't limited to the Americas. New World animals also traveled east, albeit in smaller numbers. The turkey, a domesticated bird from Mesoamerica, became popular in Europe by the 17th century, eventually becoming a holiday staple. The Muscovy, duck, guinea pigs, and llamas also made appearances in European collections and, in some cases, diets. While these animals didn't revolutionize Eurasian society the way horses did the Americas, their exoticism and novelty captured European imaginations and symbolized the expanding scope of human knowledge and curiosity. In the broader ecological picture, the introduction of animals often led to unintended consequences. Grazing animals compacted soil, spread invasive seeds, and altered water systems. Native predators were often ill-equipped to manage the new herds, leading to imbalances in local ecologies. Alongside animals came weeds, pests, and parasites, a hidden army of change. What began as a human-driven act of empire became an uncontrollable ecological cascade, in which plants, animals, microbes, and humans became entangled in new and often volatile relationships. Ultimately, the movement of animals in the Columbian exchange reveals a critical truth. The age of exploration was not just about geography, politics, or economics. It was about reshaping the very living fabric of the earth. Animals were instruments of conquest, agents of adaptation, and participants in the birth of a new global ecology. The hoofprint, like the footprint, left a mark that time would never erase. As the European empires entrenched themselves deeper into the Americas, the age of exploration gave way to the age of exploitation. Fueled by the agricultural potential of the New World and the demand for exotic goods in European markets, colonial powers carved the continents into vast economic machines. Among the most profitable and devastating of these systems was the plantation economy, a model built on monoculture, forced labor, and relentless extraction. At the center of this machine stood one commodity, sugar. By the early 16th century, European tastes had acquired a ravenous hunger for sugar. Once a rare luxury consumed in small quantities by aristocrats, sugar became more affordable and widely available as plantations expanded. It was not just a sweetener, it was a symbol of power, wealth, and status. Its demand soared across Europe, where it flavored tea, coffee, and chocolate, all new, fashionable imports from the global periphery. The pursuit of sugar would transform landscapes, drive technological innovation, and, most horrifically, enslave millions. The ideal environment for sugar cultivation was found in the Caribbean and coastal Brazil, hot, wet climates with fertile, volcanic soils. Portuguese colonists were the first to establish large-scale sugar plantations in northeastern Brazil in the 1530s. They imported techniques from their earlier plantations on Atlantic islands like Madeira and Snowtown, refining an extractive model designed for maximum profit and minimal sustainability. The Spanish soon followed in Cuba and Santo Domingo, while the French, British, and Dutch seized islands like Martinique, Barbados, and Jamaica, transforming them into sugar factories. Sugar cultivation was brutal. It required clearing forests, burning fields, and constant planting and harvesting. The canes had to be cut by hand in the searing heat, processed within hours before fermenting, and boiled down in refineries that reached scalding temperatures. Every step demanded human labor, backbreaking, repetitive, and dangerous. At first, Colonists attempted to use indigenous labor, often through systems of encomienda or forced tribute. But disease, abuse, and resistance caused native populations to collapse rapidly. As a result, Europeans turned to a new and increasingly industrial source of human labor. Enslaved Africans thus began the Atlantic slave trade, the largest forced migration in human history. Over the next 3 centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans would be captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic, though millions more died before ever reaching American shores. Ships left European ports, laden with guns, cloth, and manufactured goods, sailed to West Africa where these goods were exchanged for enslaved people, then crossed the Middle Passage, a horrific journey of weeks or months under inhumane conditions. Those who survived were sold in American ports, their bodies commodified, their futures erased. The plantation economy became the foundation of a triangular trade system. European goods went to Africa, African labor was sent to the Americas, and colonial goods like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum were shipped back to Europe. It was a system of staggering scale and cruelty, one that enriched European powers, drove the rise of capitalism, and simultaneously depopulated and destabilized West Africa, whose societies were torn apart by slave raids, wars, and the demand for captives. Plantations were more than economic enterprises. They were total institutions of control. Enslaved people were denied basic rights, branded like livestock, separated from families, and punished with unimaginable cruelty. To maintain authority, plantation owners relied on surveillance, violence, and psychological warfare. Yet, even in these dire conditions, enslaved Africans resisted through work slowdowns, sabotage, escape, and rebellion. Across the Caribbean and the American South, revolts became a persistent threat, and maroon communities, runaway slave settlements, formed in remote regions, challenging colonial dominance. Despite their wealth-generating power, sugar plantations were ecologically and socially unsustainable. They depleted soils, required constant imports of enslaved labor due to high mortality rates, and left legacies of inequality and trauma that would endure for centuries. By the 18th century, colonies like Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, had become the wealthiest and most brutal sugar-producing societies in the world. The profits of sugar fed the banks of London and Amsterdam, financed Enlightenment salons, and laid the material foundations of the modern global economy. Yet, every grain of sugar masked the suffering of human beings treated as property. The sweetness that graced the teacups of Europe was extracted through violence, coercion, and death. Behind every refined cube of sugar was a plantation, and behind every plantation, a system that bound continents together in a web of profit and pain. The exploration of the world had opened new frontiers, but it had also opened wounds, wounds carved into bodies, families, cultures, and landscapes. In the next parts, we will trace the cultural transformations of the African diaspora and the resistance that would one day ignite revolutions. The vast machinery of the Atlantic slave trade did more than uproot millions of African lives. It dispersed cultures, languages, religions, and identities across the New World in a process known today as the African diaspora. This diaspora was not merely a forced migration, but a profound, ongoing negotiation of survival, adaptation, and resistance. Despite the trauma and dehumanization, enslaved Africans forged new communities that blended African traditions with indigenous and European influences, creating vibrant cultural legacies that endure today. The journey itself was horrific. The Middle Passage, a voyage marked by overcrowding, disease, starvation, and death. Captives were packed below decks with little ventilation, often chained together and stripped of dignity. Mortality rates during the passage were staggering, sometimes reaching 15 to 20%. Survivors disembarked into societies that sought to erase their pasts and reduce them to mere labor units. Families were torn apart, ethnic identities fragmented, and languages silenced. Yet, fragments of African heritage persisted and evolved. In the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South, enslaved Afrikaans came from diverse ethnic groups: Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, Congo, Mandinka, and many others. This diversity complicated efforts to suppress cultural continuity. However, shared experiences of oppression fostered new forms of solidarity. African-derived languages, such as Creoles and Pidgins, emerged as communication tools. Blending European tongues with African syntax and vocabulary, religious practices syncretized, African gods and spirits merged with Catholic saints, giving birth to religions like Vodou in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, and Santeria in Cuba. These spiritual systems were not only acts of faith, but also forms of resistance, preserving identity in defiance of colonial authority. Music and dance became vital mediums for cultural survival. Drumming patterns, caland response songs, and dance rituals retained African rhythms and meanings, often disguised to evade plantation overseers' suspicion. These art forms served both social and spiritual purposes, reinforcing community bonds and providing psychological relief amid brutal conditions. Over generations, they influenced the development of New World musical genres, laying foundations for jazz, samba, reggae, and blues. The African diaspora also reshaped social structures. Within the confines of slavery, new kinship networks emerged. Enslaved people created surrogate families, adopting each other and forming alliances that transcended blood ties. These networks were crucial for sharing knowledge, coordinating resistance, and maintaining hope. In some regions, enslaved communities negotiated limited autonomy through cultural enclaves and maroon societies, hidden settlements of escaped slaves that persisted for decades, challenging colonial control. Despite the harshness of the system, Afrikaans also influenced colonial economies and labor practices. Enslaved people brought agricultural expertise, knowledge of rice cultivation, tropical crops, and animal husbandry, which was crucial for the profitability of plantations. Their skills were indispensable, even as colonial powers sought to erase their humanity. The legacy of the African diaspora is a testament to resilience amid atrocity. It illustrates how enslaved people were not passive victims but active agents, who shaped the cultural, social, and political landscapes of the Americas. The survival and flourishing of African traditions, often under conditions designed to extinguish them, is among the most remarkable stories of human endurance. Yet the scars of slavery remained deep. Systems of racial hierarchy, economic exploitation, and social marginalization established during the plantation era laid the groundwork for centuries of inequality. The fight for freedom, recognition, and justice would span generations, from maroon revolts and abolitionist movements to civil rights struggles that continue today. The Columbian Exchange, then, was not only about plants, animals, and disease. It was about people, about the forced migration of millions and the creation of new worlds forged in pain, creativity, and defiance. The brutal system of slavery that fueled the sugar plantations and other colonial enterprises was met with relentless resistance from the very people it sought to enslave. Though bound by chains and dehumanized, enslaved Africans and their descendants consistently fought to reclaim their freedom, dignity, and humanity. Their acts of defiance, ranging from everyday forms of resistance to full-scale revolts, shook the foundations of colonial empires and, ultimately, reshaped the political landscape of the Atlantic world. Small acts of rebellion were woven into the fabric of enslaved life. Sabotage of tools and crops, working slowly or inefficiently, feigning illness, and escaping temporarily were daily forms of resistance that disrupted plantation economies. These subtle defiance tactics undermined colonial authority and asserted control over one's own body and labor. Yet, more dramatic uprisings erupted throughout the Americas, often inspired by African cultural traditions, political ideas, or religious visions. Among the most famous and impactful was the Haitian Revolution 1791 to 1804, a monumental event that began as a slave revolt in the French colony of Saint-Domingue and culminated in the first successful abolition of slavery and the founding of the first Black Republic. The revolutionaries, led by figures such as Toussaint Louverture, drew upon a complex blend of African, French, and Enlightenment ideologies to challenge both slavery and colonialism. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through the Atlantic world, terrifying slaveholders, inspiring abolitionists, and forcing imperial powers to reconsider their systems of racial domination. Other notable revolts dotted the Barracas, the Jamaican Maroon Wars, where communities of escaped slaves fought for autonomy, the Stono Rebellion 1739 in South Carolina, a major uprising that led to harsher slave codes, the Bohaian Revolt in Brazil, fueled by African spiritual leaders, and countless smaller insurrections across plantations in the Caribbean, Central America, and North America. These rebellions were not isolated incidents, but part of a continuum of resistance that revealed the unbreakable will of enslaved peoples. Resistance also took legal and political forms as abolitionist movements gained momentum in Europe and the Americas by the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Former slaves, free black communities, and sympathetic allies campaigned for emancipation, exposing the moral contradictions and economic cruelties of slavery. These movements culminated in gradual legal reforms, emancipation acts, and the eventual outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade, though slavery itself persisted in many places for decades afterward. The struggle for freedom was not only a battle against physical bondage, but also an ideological fight to redefine humanity and citizenship. Enslaved peoples challenged the very assumptions of racial inferiority and social hierarchy that justified their oppression. Their stories, cultures, and political demands laid the groundwork for future civil rights movements, anti-colonial struggles, and the ongoing pursuit of justice. The legacy of these revolts and revolutions is a reminder that the age of exploration and its aftermath were not merely stories of European conquest and exploitation, but of endurance, resistance, and transformation. The human cost of empire was immense, but so too was the courage of those who refused to be broken. The age of exploration did more than open sea routes and establish empires. It fundamentally transformed how humans understood their planet and their place within it. The voyages of discovery shattered centuries-old worldviews, replacing myth and speculation with empirical observation, cartography, and the relentless accumulation of knowledge. The legacy of these early journeys is not only the physical reshaping of continents, but also the intellectual reshaping of the world. Before the 15th century, European maps were fragmented and often symbolic, featuring the familiar yet limited to maps, where the world was divided into three continents: Europe, Asia, and African circled by ocean and centered on Jerusalem. Knowledge was rooted in classical texts and religious doctrine, with vast unknown spaces filled by monsters, legends, or religious allegory. Exploration forced scholars and navigators to confront a much larger, more complex planet than previously imagined. Each voyage brought back new data coastlines, islands, mountain ranges, and peoples, challenging old assumptions. Cartographers, like Garadis Mercator, revolutionized map-making with projections that balanced the difficulties of representing a spherical Earth on flat surfaces. The creation of more accurate maps was not just a scientific triumph, but a political tool. Maps became instruments of imperial power, claiming territories, guiding fleets, and legitimizing colonial ambitions. The accumulation of knowledge spurred developments in navigation technology. Instruments like the astrolabe, and later the sextant, along with advances in shipbuilding and the understanding of wind patterns, such as the trade winds and westerlies, allowed sailors to venture further with more confidence. This deepened European dominance on the seas and paved the way for global trade networks. Beyond geography, the age of exploration expanded natural history. Botanists, zoologists, and physicians catalogued plants, animals, and minerals previously unknown in Europe. The work of explorers like Alexander von Humboldt would later build on these foundations, inspiring scientific inquiry and environmental awareness. Yet, this new knowledge came with costs. The power to name, classify, and control became a means to dominate and exploit. Indigenous knowledge systems were often dismissed or appropriated without credit. The legacy of exploration is thus entwined with the beginnings of Western scientific imperialism, a system that sought to master nature and peoples alike, intellectually and materially. The age of exploration planted the seeds for the modern world, intertwining continents through networks of exchange, conflict, and curiosity. It altered perceptions of space and place, transforming not just maps but the very idea of a global community. The age of exploration did more than redraw maps. It ignited profound cultural transformations that reshaped societies across continents. The unprecedented movement of peoples, ideas, and goods forged new global connections while also sparking conflicts that revealed deep clashes of worldview, religion, and identity. This period marks the beginnings of what scholars call the early modern global society, where cultures collided, blended, and sometimes violently opposed one another. As Europeans expanded into the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they encountered civilizations with rich histories, languages, and belief systems. Initial encounters were often marked by curiosity and exchange. New foods, technologies, and art forms traveled both ways. Indigenous Americans introduced Europeans to crops like maize, potatoes, and cacao, while Europeans brought horses, firearms, and metal tools. These exchanges reshaped diets, economies, and social structures on every continent. However, the interactions were not equal or peaceful. European imperial ambitions were undergirded by a conviction of cultural and religious superiority, often framed in terms of a divine mandate to spread Christianity and civilization. This led to missionary efforts, forced conversions, and the destruction of indigenous religious practices and institutions. Conflicts arose not only between Europeans and native peoples but also among different indigenous groups. As alliances shifted and power dynamics were altered by the introduction of new weapons, diseases, and trade goods, the cultural consequences of these encounters were complex. Hybrid identities emerged in colonial societies, giving rise to mestizo, mulatto, and Creole populations, who embodied the intermingling of European, African, and indigenous heritage. Languages mixed, religions blended, and new cultural expressions flourished. From the syncretic religions of the Caribbean to the fusion cuisines of Latin America and Southeast Asia. Yet, cultural hybridity also existed alongside systems of segregation and racial hierarchy. Colonial governments codified differences, creating rigid caste systems that defined social status, legal rights, and economic opportunities by race and ancestry. These divisions sowed long-term social tensions and inequalities that persist in many post-colonial societies. The age of exploration also triggered profound demographic changes. The introduction of old-world diseases such as smallpox decimated indigenous populations, sometimes wiping out entire communities. Conversely, the forced migration of millions of Africans and the resettlement of European colonists reshaped demographic patterns, leading to the emergence of multicultural societies, whose legacies are still being negotiated today. Finally, cultural exchange was not limited to the Americas. In Asia and Africa, European traders and missionaries encountered powerful states and civilizations with their own complex cultures and histories. Here too, interactions were marked by negotiation, accommodation, and resistance, influencing local politics, economies, and societies. In sum, the age of exploration set in motion a global cultural transformation, a mixing pot of innovation, adaptation, conflict, and survival. It laid the foundations of our interconnected world, where cultural exchange remains a source of both richness and contestation. The age of exploration did not merely open new routes and cultures, laid the foundations for a global economic system that persists today, shaped by vast inequalities born from centuries of empire, exploitation, and exchange. The emergence of global capitalism during this period transformed local economies into interconnected nodes within a vast web of trade, finance, and production, reshaping wealth, power, and social relations on a planetary scale. At the heart of this transformation was the rise of mercantilism, a set of economic policies adopted by European powers aimed at accumulating wealth through trade surpluses and colonial exploitation. Colonies were seen primarily as sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods from the metropole. This system incentivized the extraction of precious metals like silver and gold, agricultural products such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and later, industrial commodities. The influx of American silver, particularly from mines like Potosi in modern Bolivia, revolutionized the global economy by fueling European money supplies and trade networks that extended as far as Asia. Silver coins became a universal currency, facilitating transactions from Manila to London, knitting continents into a single economic system for the first time. This new economic order also depended heavily on forced labor, including the enslavement of Africans and the exploitation of indigenous peoples. The plantation system and mining operations produced vast wealth, but at catastrophic human and environmental costs. The profits enriched European elites and merchants while entrenching racial and class inequalities that shaped social hierarchies in the Americas and beyond. The age of exploration also saw the rise of powerful trading companies, such as the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. These entities wielded immense power, combining private enterprise with quasi-governmental authority, negotiating treaties, waging wars, and controlling vast territories. Their activities helped establish the dominance of European powers in Asia and set the stage for centuries of colonial rule. financial innovations such as joint stock companies, stock exchanges, and banking institutions emerged to manage the risks and profits of global trade, laying the groundwork for modern capitalism. Cities like Amsterdam, London, and later New York became financial hubs whose influence shaped economies worldwide. Yet this system was inherently unequal. Wealth flowed unevenly, concentrating in European metropoles, while colonies provided labor and resources under coercive conditions. Indigenous populations were dispossessed, ecosystems disrupted, and social orders transformed to serve imperial interests. These patterns of inequality became embedded in global economic relations, creating disparities that remain stark to this day. Moreover, resistance to these economic structures persisted. Indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and colonized communities challenged the legitimacy of colonial rule and economic exploitation through rebellion, negotiation, and cultural survival, influencing the evolution of economic and political systems. In sum, the Age of Exploration inaugurated a global economy that was at once dynamic and deeply unequal, world connected by trade and capital but divided by power and race. Understanding this legacy is essential to grasp the origins of the modern world's economic patterns, conflicts, and challenges.